Delia McCabe. Wiki Delia, as your husband calls you. Welcome to Dad Saves America.
Thank you for inviting me, John.
So we met at an event together that we were putting on with Catherine Burbelsing, who's one of my favorite people in the world. And we very quickly realized that we have a lot of shared interests and shared ways of looking at things. But you know what you're talking about, whereas I'm just like a guy that's trying to figure stuff out, and half the time I'm swimming in waters way deeper than I can handle. So you began life in clinical psychology and moved to neurobiology. What's wrong with clinical psychology? Why did you start going down that path and ultimately change course? Let's start there, because there's like Abigail Schreier has the book Bad Therapy. There's a lot of stuff in our culture that seems to be outgrowths of the therapeutic mindset and the culture of therapy everywhere we look. And you were like, I think I'm going to study the actual brain instead of talking to people.
Absolutely. My decision was based on the fact that there were too many questions that clinical psychology couldn't answer. One of the main problems we know is the replication crisis in psychology. So, researchers do this experiment and they find, this is a fantastic result. And then they try and replicate that and, it doesn't work anymore. And that's a huge problem, because understanding human behavior, we want to figure out what happens under most circumstances with most people. And that is also kind of like a complex issue. But I looked at these people that I was working with and I was saying to myself, there's something else going on here. Talking about cognitive behavior therapy, trying to get them to change their minds. Why did some people battle more to change their minds? And my big question was, what actually happened within the brain when people changed their minds? And what was mental illness really? And what led to people having aberrant behavior? So I wanted to look at brain development very, very deeply. And clinical psychology didn't answer those questions for me. I think for me, the big turning point came when I was working with a group of school children who were really smart. And these were kids that I should have been doing really well at school. We call them underachievers today. And I couldn't get to the psychological variables behind why they were underachieving. So I had a control group who were smart and achieving, and then I had this experimental group, and I was trying to intervene in a way to get them to say, hey, I want to study. Hey, I am smart. I can do well. And nothing that I did was working.
And how are you measuring the achievement? Was it just grades, or was it a broader range of things than just grades?
I was looking at the grades, I was looking at their study habits, and I was looking at their IQ, their potential. And I was looking at what their interests were. So I was looking at all these different variables, and I had a little bit of extra space on one of my questionnaires. And I said to them, and this is where destiny steps in and you go, what the hell? I said, what's your favorite food? And every single one of the children in my experimental group, that's the smart kids who were battling, loved junk food. And the children in my control group were different. They didn't. Now, when I look back, I understand that there were lots of variables at play. Many of the children in the experimental group were having challenges at home. One of the children had lost a sibling. Another child was going through a parent's divorce, a very challenging divorce. Another one of the children felt really neglected by his parents, although they were wealthy. So there were psychological variables, absolutely. But this was a big question for me. And it happened at a pivotal point because I was pregnant with my first child. And we were also doing a semigration to another part of South Africa. And I said, I need to just investigate this. How does nutrition impact brain function? And that took me down the neurobiology, neurophysiology, neurochemistry path, because I discovered that what these children were actually doing, they were trying to make themselves feel better by eating ultra-processed foods. And when I discovered that, I thought, okay, they're actually self-medicating with food, because the body is capable of producing opioids. These are endogenous opioids. So when you go to the gym or you go for a run and you get that beautiful endorphin flush, that's an endogenous opioid synthesis happening under the covers. You don't think about it, but that's actually what's happening. Now, the same thing happens with these ultra-processed foods. You get this flush of pleasure, and it also ameliorates your anxiety to a lesser degree. So you learn from eating this food it becomes a habit to eat this food. You don't understand what's happening from a neurochemical perspective, but it's still happening. And so you build this neural pathway, this habit, which is related to how you feel the emotions after consuming this food. And that led to me going down a completely different path. And my peers thought I was insane because why do you care what's happening? Just get people to change. And I was like, well,
wait, why do you care what's happening? Just get people to change. That's a really weird response.
well, you see,
because it's like, if you want to make a change happen, isn't asking the causes behind the thing that you want changed, isn't that like an essential part of the process of understanding anything in the world?
Well, to me, that seemed pretty logical nearly 30 years ago. But these people were trained in particular frameworks of analyzing behavior and getting people to shift. And we know that CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is the most well acknowledged and the most effective way to get people to change, because you're getting them to change the way they think and you're asking them to question why they're thinking those things. But for me, it went deeper. I wanted to know what was the environment that neurons needed to be in to make that change as easy as possible. Because I figured, who's going to push a car when the tires are flat? Only a lunatic. Wouldn't you pump the tires and then push the car, make it easier for the person to change? So I was going a level deeper to discover, let's set the scene for getting the brain to be in its right environment so that those neurons are primed, so that they have all the nutrients required, so that connectivity is optimized. Because how do we change behavior? We change behavior by forming new neural connections between neurons to form a new pathway so that the brain says, this is not an alternative. I can choose this pathway instead. And to be able to get those neurons to prime those neurons, to get them to be in an optimal state of connectivity, requires specific nutrients.
All right, real quick. If you like what you're seeing and you want to see more, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell. It lets YouTube know that you want to see more Dad Saves America, and it helps spread the word. So it's one of the best things you can do to support what we're doing. And now, back to the show. I remember, but I can't tell if this is a real memory or not, that there's been some work done around behavior in prisons related to nutrition and really substantial differences in behavior of prison populations if they had a better nutritional profile in their diet. Have you seen this work? Am I remembering this correctly?
You are remembering correctly. And that's some of the research that I looked at when I started down this different path, the path less traveled, because what they were looking at, they were saying, okay, let's supplement some of these prisoners and see how their behavior changes. And they became less aggressive. They became more amenable to different behavior. And so who was going to fund this, though? This is the question. Who was going to fund this research and make sure that this became, general knowledge? Not too many researchers got grants for that, because that means the prisons had to change the food that they fed the people. And who wants to do that? That's going to take off your bottom line. So it's a complex issue, because when I explain to people, just to give you an example, let's take zinc as an example. Mm-hmm. Now, zinc is a very important mineral, and it's an essential mineral, which means we can't make it. We have to get it from our diet. That's the term, that's what essential means in the world of nutritional neuroscience specifically. So if you don't get enough zinc, there's a flow-on effect, but that means 300 different enzymes don't get made. So that means your body battles to make serotonin, because you need zinc to make serotonin. You also need zinc to make melatonin. So then serotonin, which is the foundation of melatonin, you don't get that. You also need zinc for optimal energy production. You need zinc so that your appetite works really well, because serotonin is linked to appetite. Zinc is also involved in our taste buds. So when people are deficient in zinc, their food doesn't taste really good. So they either go and gravitate to highly processed foods, or otherwise they don't feel like eating and they lose their appetite entirely. Now, it's very clear to see that zinc has a role to play in something called anorexia.
Yes, I was reading about this from your work and your writing. So Blake, break that down, because the biggest thing, and this can also be a place where we can talk about some of the other things that surround anorexia and other things like it, which is like the weird social contagion aspect of anorexia. But what does zinc have to do with anorexia?
So when I started investigating this, I realized how interconnected our psychology is, the way we behave and the way we view the world with what goes on under the covers. And so young girls and increasingly young boys feel a lack of control in their lives for whatever reason. And this often happens during puberty when their bodies are changing. The world is now responding to them differently. Maybe they've had an untoward approach from somebody. Maybe someone has said something about their changing body, especially young girls when their breasts start developing. And so they feel that they have very little control over their environment. And so what do they have control over? What they eat. So now they start limiting a whole lot of foods. And often the foods that they limit are foods that are rich in zinc and foods that are rich in iron, things like red meat. So what happens is that they are now compromising their capacity to make good decisions, because a brain that doesn't have the right nutrients makes poor decisions. So they continue making these decisions even though it is harming them. And they end up with body dysmorphia. They look in a mirror and they see themselves much larger than they really are. This is because zinc also has a role to play in how we perceive ourselves. They also start suffering from digestive complaints. So they feel very bloated, and that further increases the desire not to eat. They also feel very much more anxious because now they can't make serotonin. And their appetite is all over the show because, once again, not being able to make serotonin. And they sleep really poorly, so that also compromises them. And their metabolism becomes completely wonky. Now this is a brain that's completely compromised. This brain cannot think clearly. So you say to this person, this brain, look, if you don't eat, you're actually going to die. And they don't perceive it because their brain isn't working properly. So when I realized how the impact of psychology, how it can change our behavior, and that behavior then changes what we do, and what we do impacts how our brain functions, I started looking at this whole intersection so much differently, completely differently. Because, as an example, when I went to go and look at doing my PhD, I went to a lot of different universities, and because of the weird process that I'd taken to get to that point, they all said to me, you must choose a subject. You must choose either psychology or neuroscience or nutrition. And I said, I can't make a choice because they're all intimately connected. You can't just choose one. Then I'm stuck in a silo. And so I landed up at Adelaide Medical School. And they said, we love firstly translational research. That's research that you can take from research and implement it in the population. And we also love multidisciplinary research.
I like the idea that research that has an application in reality is like a subdiscipline of academia. It's like we have all this research that we can't do anything with, which is most of it. But then you could specialize in the research that we can do something with. Oh, gosh. I've heard this from a lot of my academic friends, that among the many pathologies of academia, this sort of hyper specialization that then creates these like bizarro echo chambers where what you're trying to do is publish the weirdest possible thing in your narrow subdiscipline, and that you're trading on this sort of fundamentally like currency of popularity within your niche, which is called peer review and citation. So I can find something super weird, that's some flaw in human nature. Ideally, it undermines rationality. And then, ta-da, now I'm awesome. Is that what you were seeing as you were going through this? Is that because that's what it sounds like.
That's exactly what happens, John. You see, when you narrow down into a subject, what I say happens, you get into a rut. And the deeper you dig that rut, the further you can see out from outside, from within that hole. You can't see outside anymore. So that becomes your whole world. And that's your lens that you see the world through. It's only through looking at a number of different disciplines together that you end up having a better perspective of what's actually going on. Because very seldom in life, and especially in this super complex world that we've all co-created, is one variable acting on its own. There are interacting variables, and those variables, understanding that interaction gives you a much better chance at solving a problem.
So that's an interesting framing, because so you're talking about zinc and you're showing all these follow-on effects. And as I hear you explain that, it's linear, right? Because that's how we talk. We talk in order over time. And that produces this thing that I'm sensitive to, which is the narrative fallacy. This follows that, and there's a logical fallacy there, right? Like it's like I forget the exact Latin, but it's basically this follows that, therefore that caused this.
Yes.
Ad hoc, post hoc, I forget. But that is one of the things that we all experience all the time is we hear these things and it becomes a silver bullet. So how did you know, or how do you understand where like zinc and diet in anorexia in particular fits in here? Was it like a very important causal piece of the puzzle? Is it one of many things that are all moving together at the same time? So it's, yes, they're zinc deficient because they're not eating, but there's these other forces at work that, and how like what proportion of the impacts are the zinc versus the other things?
Well, it doesn't start out being important. What starts out being important is the perspective that this young person has about their life. And then when they start limiting the food, it grows in importance because now the lack of that is causing them to not change their behavior and see the world in a different way. What's also happening at the same time, so we can't just say that zinc is the most important thing. What's also happening is they're building neural pathways for particular behavior patterns. And this is happening while their brain is hyperplastic, while their brain is developing really very, what's the right word? It's what we call opportunistic periods of development. So the brain is hyperplastic for particular aspects of development. So normally when this happens, the brain is hyperplastic for social engagement and acceptance and peer connection. So now this brain is going...
And what is the age range here where this is starting?
From about 10 to 12, children get very interested in peers.
Middle school.
Yeah, middle school. And then
the Hunger Games.
Yeah, and as they go up, they get into adolescence and then they become more curious a little bit later in terms of meaning, what's their role to play in the world and so on. So that is all happening at the same time. We don't just stop one thing and it's happening, in that particular period of time. This is all moving along. Now, the relationships with peers are moving along. How peers are observing this person is moving along. More and more zinc deficiency is causing less and less capacity at school in relation to learning. Memory, focus, concentration, and also being able to form relationships because people are saying, this is a very odd person. They're killing themselves by not eating. So we've got all these different variables. So it's very hard to weight them, John. You can't say, well, this is more important than that. We do know that when these young people get the right supplements, they have a much greater chance of getting better because then they can start thinking more clearly, then they make better decisions. Then their body naturally takes over because it's not a normal response to starve yourself to death. The brain will then go, okay, I'm hungry again. I feel hunger because serotonin is being synthesized. I can sleep now because melatonin is being synthesized. I can think more clearly and make a decision that this is not good behavior and I need some help. So you need a good therapist in that instance, and you also need someone to say, hold on a second, let's do bloods. What else is this person deficient in? Because if they're only, it's not just a deficiency in zinc. I just highlighted that because it's an important one. A deficiency in iron would be just as devastating because iron is a huge component of hemoglobin. Hemoglobin carries oxygen to our cells. Hemoglobin and iron are responsible for energy production, neurotransmitter production and synthesis, and even myelination, which is the way neurons insulate themselves, the axons insulate themselves to make sure that our connectivity is at a great speed, that neurons communicate really quickly. So just think of what happens if you have an iron deficiency. I have spoken to young girls who are now deficient in iron because they have been watching TikTok videos and Instagram videos that say, no, you mustn't eat anything, no animal products. So they become vegans. I look at these girls, you can see that they're physically ill. You can also see that they're not thinking clearly. And the reason they're not thinking clearly is they're not getting enough oxygen into their brain. So that's impacting how the brain is developing, and it's impacting their thinking process. So there are all of these ramifications that occur from first principles.
I read a book called The Talent Code that was one of the recommended books of one of my son's schools, Acton Academy. And it was one of these sort of pop psychology books, but its basic premise was that we learn at the edges of our capability, that we, right at the moment of struggle and like staying in that state of sort of struggle where you're not yet mastered, but you have something, but you don't have it all. And it's sort of frustrating, but if you stay at it, that is where learning takes place. Because if you just like take any skill, like playing the piano, for example, I think that was one in the book. You're constantly progressing when you're learning how to play the piano. So, and the hardest parts are always good. There's always like new hard parts to learn, and the easy parts get easy, and you sort of stop learning once it becomes like muscle memory and you've got it down pat. And the neurobiological component of this book was saying what's happening at that edge where you're in that challenge space is the myelin is being wrapped around the neural pathways or the neurons. And I barely understand what, I'm hearing these things in their words and I'm kind of constructing an image in my mind. And it sounds like Ethernet cable. It sounds like, like in here is Ethernet cable, which my buddy who lives here in Austin, Bob Metcalf, is the father of Ethernet. The more it's well wrapped, the faster it can carry data across it because it's actually insulated from the noise of the environment. And so Cat 8, which is what we've got here, can carry like 40 megabits a second, whereas like Cat 5 can't. And that's when I hear this like production of myelin, how important is that? Because this book, like a lot of these kind of books, sort of said, this is this really important thing. Learning at the edge of your experience and having this sort of myelin process be able to take place, which it didn't even talk about the nutritional necessities to be able to feed that process. How important is that part of it?
Extremely important, because if you don't have neurons that are well insulated, you don't get the message to where it's going, and it doesn't go there at a speed. So it can get lost.
And what is that actually? Are they actually like wires, like literally that have a wrapping? Like explain this to me like mechanically.
It's a compound made up of fat and protein, and it gets laid on this axon. Like, just imagine an electrical cable. You're using the Ethernet cable. Mm-hmm. It's a very good example. It is a covering that makes sure that nothing escapes, and it gets there really quickly. And it's got little tiny little components on it that jump, so that it's an electrochemical impulse that runs down this tube and makes sure that message gets from one neuron to another at the fastest speed. Now, when that process of myelination is compromised, and it can be compromised because of a lack of iron, a lack of B12, a lack of the right essential fats as well, which is another part of this big conversation. That neuron doesn't get its message to where it needs to go really quickly. Now, this is a huge problem, and when a brain is compromised with these nutrients in utero and then in early childhood, we know that cognition is impacted directly. And this is one of the reasons that nutrition is so important in the developing brain, because even if your parents were really smart, so you've got this genetic intellectual potential, you cannot realize that genetic potential because you do not have the raw materials to make what is required to get all of those neurons connected as much as they are. Because we're all born with about 86 billion neurons. All of us, we're born with them. But the way they connect is what makes us either smart or capable, and is what gives us our skills. So we know that children that, for example, start learning to play the piano, they have a superior capacity in relation to maths. That's just something that we know.
It's funny because I like to play the piano. I'm not very good at it because it's been off and on for me. But I remember when I was at college at Penn State, I took up piano lessons again, and this is very stereotypical. All of the teachers were Asian math students who were like classical pianists.
Well, there we go. So something about playing the piano and something about the way we're moving our fingers across the keyboard stimulates parts of the brain that is more attuned to mathematical capacity and abstract thinking.
Well, I think the structure of music itself is highly mathematical, and the patterns and the way the patterns interact, it is like a formula.
Absolutely. So now when the brain is exposed to that as it's developing, those neural pathways, those myelin sheaths become really well consolidated. And that's why we use the term neurons that fire together, wire together. They form these pathways. This is also, unfortunately, the dark side of neuroplasticity, because when people speak about neuroplasticity, they speak about it as this wonderful, magical thing. And it is wonderful and magical because your brain is changing shape as I'm speaking to you now. You're taking on new pieces of information. I'm thinking about things in a different way. So our brains will not be the same shape when we walk away. However, the dark side of neuroplasticity is that the brain also gravitates to things that don't serve it long term. Things like cocaine addiction, alcohol addiction, pornography, simply because the brain releases a whole lot of dopamine under those conditions. And the brain gravitates to dopamine. Why? Because dopamine is part of what allowed us to survive and proliferate as a species. Dopamine is released when we eat a lovely meal. Dopamine is released when we have sex. Dopamine is released when we do things that are good for us and that serve us long term.
Right.
So that's the dark side, the Achilles heel of this beautiful neuroplasticity.
It's like why we love sweets, right? It's like sweets, the sweet flavor indicates that the fruit from the tree is ripe enough to eat, which is not the same thing as a Snickers bar.
Absolutely not. The Snickers bar will release a whole lot more dopamine, but also it'll endogenous opioids. So that's why emotional eating becomes such a big thing when people are chronically stressed, because they're trying to reduce that cortisol. The neurons and the body's marinating in cortisol, and one way to reduce that is by introducing endogenous opioids.
So I personally have this experience, and it is well established in my home, which is when I get hungry, I get angry and irrational. And very often, if I'm starting to get irritable, either my son or my wife, Lisa, will say, "You're hungry, aren't you?" They'll always be right. Like when I start to get out of sorts and explosive, I'm hungry.
Well, they call it hangry for a reason. And the reason that happens is because your blood glucose dips. And when your blood glucose dips, your brain sends a message to your body, basically to your adrenal glands, to pump out adrenaline, to get you moving to find food. And so when that happens, it's naturally we become a little bit more aggressive and we become very alert to where that food is. But that requires a little bit of self-reflection. And so your family has obviously got that self-reflection down to a fine art, even if it hasn't happened with you. But that is what happens, John. It's blood glucose takes that big dip. Now, the problem is that it's not just hunger that causes that blood glucose to take a dip. When we get really angry, when we don't have a good night's sleep, if we feel very stressed, that also happens. And also even dehydration can cause a blood glucose dip. So blood glucose keeps the brain running smoothly, and a lot of people don't realize that this is one of the reasons they become anxious and ultimately also can become depressed if this happens on an ongoing basis. I've got a slide that I use in the training, and I show people, your blood glucose should stay in this green zone. And all these other things are what can cause it to go out of that green zone. And as I've just mentioned, there are quite a few variables that can do that. Now, the reason why that matters is because the brain is 2% of our body weight, but it uses upwards of 20 to 25% of the carbs that we consume to keep it running.
Of the carbs?
Yeah, of the carbs we consume.
So carbs, not just calories, but specifically carbohydrates.
Because carbohydrates get converted into glucose. Adenosine triphosphate is the technical term. And our neurons use ATP to produce the energy, the electrochemical energy that the brain needs to function.
Jessie, who's sitting in that room over there, her brother plays competitive chess, and she has said that her brother has told her he has lost weight during chess matches because of, I guess, how many carbs and calories the brain is consuming in competitive chess. Which is that also why we just can have a long day of doing cognitive work that doesn't involve a lot of physical activity and feel physically exhausted?
Absolutely. And this leads us perfectly into what the prefrontal cortex does. So the prefrontal cortex is the most sophisticated part of the brain. And this is the part of the brain that is involved in things like time travel. And this simply means you can quickly whiz into the past and imagine something that happened in the past and have all the regret and guilt that can come with it. Or you can whiz into the future and be anxious about what could be happening in the future. So the brain is a time-traveling machine, and the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that allows us to do that. It's the part of the brain that says, what could happen?
Is that also the place for executive function?
That's the other term. We call it the executive functioning area of the brain. Now, the thing about this part of the brain is it's the greediest part of the brain in terms of metabolic function. So it's only 10% of brain weight, but it uses up to 25% of that 25% that I mentioned to keep itself running. Now, why does it do this? It does this because it doesn't have a lot of workarounds. You are encountering new information, and your prefrontal cortex now has to make new connections, working with your working memory as you hold that information in place, and your brain is going, what will I do about this? What does this mean? Is there a pattern here? Can I detect the pattern? Can I predict what could happen next? All of these things are happening, and as I said, there are no shortcuts to this. It's never done these things before. Now, if you've done these things before, you've got a neural pathway. You know exactly how it happens, and you save energy. That's what a habit is. A habit is formed so that you don't have to use a lot of neural energy. Prefrontal cortex uses a lot of neural energy, which is why you feel exhausted at the end of the day.
So do habits not, things that become second nature, like driving in normal conditions, do they not really activate the prefrontal cortex? Is this how, like, I think about if I'm sometimes I think we've all experienced this. You're driving along a familiar route and you can get home and sort of not remember that you did the drive. It's like, wait, how did I even get here? Like you kind of just, like your brain went somewhere and you were, and then like you were just doing it.
Yeah. Muscle memory is part of that, and that neural pathway that's been established. So what would happen, we've got different types of attention. So the attention that you and I are experiencing now is conscious attention. We are focused on each other. We're listening carefully. You actively listening, which we have to get to again, and I'm responding. And so we're having this conversation, very, very conscious attention. Then there is the kind of attention that will interfere with that. That's disruptive attention. So if a tiger jumped into this room or there was a loud bang, suddenly this focused attention would be shifted because of this new thing that was disrupting this attention. Now, when you're driving home, you stay in that automatic zone, if you want to call it that, because you are now, you know the path. You've got this neural pathway. Autopilot, absolutely. But if something was to happen, if a car was to jump out in front of you, quickly you'd respond.
Mm-hmm.
Because
hopefully.
Yeah, you would.
Yeah.
And I can promise you would respond because I know what will happen in your brain. Your amygdala and your hypothalamus would pick up on that threat immediately, then would send a message to your pituitary gland to tell your adrenal glands to pump out glucose as fast as possible to get it to your muscles to be able to flee or fight. Now, that happens between 30 to 60 seconds, that happens. And it has to happen faster than cognition because otherwise you wouldn't be here. So I can tell you for sure that you would respond if a car jumped in front of you because your body responds before your brain has a chance. And that's the HPA response.
This might be a diversion from the thread we're on, but I have seen and I've heard these claims that we can observe activity in the brain that is happening before cognitive thought or choice. That it's part of an argument that we are essentially a deterministic creature, that we don't have free will because of this. And I don't fully know even exactly what that's describing, because how do you know when choice happens? Like, how are you measuring when the choice is made, and how do we know? But do you know what I'm talking? I imagine you know what I'm referencing.
I do.
And what's going on there? And is that a legitimate way to think about this, or is that missing the ball, missing something?
It's a very negative way of looking at our existence as a species. So we can choose to follow that path if we want to or not. But the science tells us that from an emotional perspective, we do respond before cognition. And we have to do that. That's the reason we survived and our genes proliferated. Because if we said to ourselves as we were wandering through the forest, I'm not really going to bother about that rustle in the bushes. Maybe it's not really anything important. And it turned out to be a tiger. We would die. So cognition has to come second. Emotion has to come first.
There's a couple things that end up shading into philosophy, which I know we're going to get to, so that this points to for me. So one sort of I had a digital marketing guy that worked for me years and years ago, and his dad was a marketer, and he was like, "Oh, you got to talk to my dad. You guys really get along." So I'm talking to him, Mr. Lee, and he said, "The way I understand human behavior is that we have a decision sandwich. We frame our decisions rationally. That's the bread on the bottom of the top. We explain after the fact our decisions rationally. But in the middle, whether it's peanut butter or bologna or ham and cheese, we make those decisions emotionally / intuitively. Our gut determines the decision. We go out shopping for cars. We've got spec sheets. We've been on Consumer Reports and Car and Driver all day long. We know what we think sort of fits the matrix of criteria rationally about price and features and room and et cetera, use cases, costs and benefits. And then we drive the cars. And then there's the car that we just love. It's just like, ooh, I just like this. Ooh, it's really nice. Oh, I want this car. And we make and we buy the car we want if we can afford it. And then after the fact, we then tell a rational story about like, oh, well, this is why. I really wanted the Tesla because of this or that, or I really wanted whatever. Does that track with your understanding of the biology of the brain, that's what's going on?
Absolutely. So let me tell you some stories. These are research stories, and it's going to highlight this beautifully because decision-making cannot be removed from our embodied state. So in about, I think, the Challenger explosion, that was 1986, 87. Do you remember where you were when it happened?
I was 9 or 10 years old, so no, not really.
Okay. So as clever researchers do, they decided, let's use this event and let's investigate light bulb memories. And so what these researchers did, they contacted these people in this group that they were working with, and they said, okay, tell us where you were when you saw or heard about the explosion, what you were busy doing, and how you felt. And they got them to write a story about this event. And they said, okay, we want to test light bulb memories, how emotion is tied to the memory that you make.
What does this mean, light bulb memory?
That's the term for it. A light bulb memory, something that happens because of a highly emotive experience.
Okay,
the memory that you make.
A light bulb goes like, oh, if somebody says that and you're, where were you in JFK? Like I remember exactly the details, or I think I do.
Okay.
Of
yes.
Of 9/11. I was on a bus sitting next to a guy that was maybe Vietnamese or Korean, had an accent. I didn't realize at the time because he was asleep, but as soon as he woke up and started talking, he did. I get a call from my friend Uralis that there was an explosion at one of the towers. I'm not yet close to the towers on my way in on the bus. Suddenly, all the phones on the bus start to ring, and then the cell phone network gets jammed, and the guy sitting next to me wakes up and says, "No New York," because the bus is now stopped. And I say to him something like, "Oh my God, I sure hope not," because it was like became clear that we were under attack or something. And I just took myself back there. I could feel myself being on that bus just now. I think I am.
Okay, so let's have a look at that. I was sailing in Turkey when that happened, and I can still remember the jets from America flying into Afghanistan the next morning.
Yes, so
we were watching. So yes, the embodied
So I've crossed
experience.
the streams with the Challenger, but for me, this one is one that's work. So,
No. This is great. I'm glad that you're talking about this because what they discovered 2.5 years later when they went and examined how these people recalled that memory, they discovered that about 25% of the people had it very wrong. Then they discovered that about 50% of the people had a lesser margin of error. But less than 10% of the people had everything correct. But the thing that was the most amazing was what one person said. And this is why I'm leading into this discussion. The person said, that is my handwriting, but that's not what happened.
When reading back what they wrote?
Yes, they said, that is my handwriting, but that's not what happened. So what I'm alluding to here, what I'm leading up to, is something called the feeling of knowing. Okay, so you have a feeling of knowing about what happened and how it happened. The feeling of knowing is mistaking a belief or a feeling for knowledge about facts and reality.
This cuts to the core of so much stuff.
Absolutely it does. And when I discovered this, John, I was like, what the hell? So for me, I wrote a Substack that said this is the most dangerous feeling in the world.
The feeling of knowing.
The feeling of knowing, where you mistake a feeling for knowledge about reality and facts. So, next story. Now, this is in 1974, and this is a very famous experiment. Another two researchers decided to see what happens when they test people under conditions of high anxiety. Mm-hmm. And so what they did, they had an experimental group and a control group. The experimental group was a bunch of young men who walked over a wonky bridge over flowing water, over 200 feet in the air, and the control group was just 10 feet above the running water. But what they did, they sent a woman across the bridge to meet the men as they were walking, and she said, will you please fill out this survey for me? And they filled out the survey of this experience that they were involved in. And she said, here's my telephone number if you need to ask me any questions after this experiment. And she tore it off and she gave it to them. Now, the results were really telling because 50% of the people that walked across the bridge, the 200-foot plus bridge, phoned the woman. Only 12.5% of the people that walked over the 10-foot bridge phoned the woman. And that's a huge discrepancy. And so what they discovered, and they term this misattribution of arousal. So what happened? These men walking across the bridge were highly anxious. This was a scary experience for them. But their brain said to them, I think I'm attracted to this woman.
Oh, so like literally arousal, misattribution. So this woman comes over, it's just part of this experimental weird thing.
Absolutely.
And they're like,
I'm attracted to her. So
she gave me her number. It's like this.
Yeah.
Okay.
But only 12.5% of the ones that walked over the low bridge phoned her. So this is a significant difference. So these researchers knew that they were onto something. They didn't understand it exactly, and it's many years ago that they did that experiment, but it's very often used to explain this embodiedness that we have in relation to emotions. Because remember, emotions are what your body feels. It's a visceral response. Feelings are what we call them. So they took the emotion of anxiety and they labeled it attraction.
Years and years ago, there was this great, I don't know if it's still around, there was this great podcast called Radio Lab on NPR. There was there was a part of NPR that wasn't complete nonsense. It was actually pretty good. Planet Money, Radio Lab, This American Life, I'd put in that category. And, before like the blonde Cylon that doesn't think truth is useful took over. But they had this story that seemed exactly right, which is that we have a feedback loop between our physiology and our emotional state that tricks us, and or can kind of perpetuate things in ways that we don't intend. And the example that they used was you get into an argument with your spouse, and it is a kind of a not sexual arousal. But your emotions are heightened. Your hands get sweaty. Your blood pressure raises. Your heartbeat rises, and you get into this disagreement. And then you reach a conclusion, and there's nowhere more to go. You sort of talked it out. You're done. So cognitively, you're done.
Yes.
But your body is still heightened. You're still uneasy. Your heart rate is still running. And they play this out in real time. And all of us that have had relationships, I think, have experienced this and are guilty of it. I certainly am. And it's like you're done, and you came to a conclusion, but then it's like a fire that was starting to die, but it's still got enough heat that it reignites. And then you start, hey, but you really did say X, Y, and Z. And you restart the argument for no reason. And what they were arguing was that is your mind following your body's cue. Like you're sitting there and hey, we reached a conclusion. And then sort of like you're saying, well, why am I still uneasy? Why am I still uncomfortable? I guess we didn't reach a conclusion, and you start back at it. Is that connected to this? Is that part of, like, how do you understand that? Is that, because that's a thing that just came to mind as you're talking about this sense of arousal and heightened awareness and the weird stuff that it makes us do.
Well, also there's makeup sex. When people fight and they get highly aroused, they say, well, they have sex, and then it's great. And so some people end up having a fight so they can have makeup sex. It's all related to the same thing because our bodies are part of our brain. And the next story I tell you is going to make it even clearer. So I don't know if you've heard about Antonio Damasio. I'm sure you've heard of him. Even if you haven't heard of him, you've heard of the book he wrote, Descartes' Error.
I have heard of Descartes' Error,
so we're getting a little bit. I
don't know if I read it, so we'll see. We'll see how much of this is remotely familiar to me.
We're getting a little bit into the philosophy now because he wrote that book as an argument against the philosophers who were speaking about separating our cognition from our emotion. In other words, separating mind from body. And he wrote Descartes' Error as a counter-argument to them for very good reason. And this is the story that he tells. A person came to his clinic one day and he called him Elliot. And Elliot arrived and it was discovered, Damasio is a neurologist, it was discovered that he had a tumor in his orbitofrontal cortex. Now think of it as the underbelly of your prefrontal cortex. Now this is an area that is deeply involved in emotion regulation and also how cognition works with emotion. So
how we understand what we feel? Yes,
and also it's based on us making decisions and our emotions in relation to what we value.
Big stuff.
Big stuff, okay. So
should I get married? Should I buy this car, house? Should we have kids?
What do I believe in?
Should I change jobs?
What do I believe in? What's the meaning of life?
What matters?
What matters. So Damasio takes the tumor out. And just to put this into context, this is a part of the brain that is significantly more active and bigger in humans than it is in animals. Okay, so it has a very important role to play in our brains and how we live our lives. So he takes the tumor out, and just to say who Elliot was, Elliot had a management job. He was highly respected in his church, in his community, in his family. He was a good father. He was an upstanding citizen, in other words. So they take the tumor out, and Elliot starts battling. Elliot gets fired from his job. Elliot gets divorced. Elliot is fooled by a con man. He loses all his money. He declares bankruptcy. He ends up living with his parents. Now, that may seem alarming, and it is alarming. But the thing that alarmed Damasio the most was that Elliot didn't care. Elliot was completely unemotional about all this terribleness that had happened to him. And it stemmed from the fact that Elliot was incapable of making a decision. He couldn't choose between using a blue or a red pen. He couldn't choose between what restaurant to go to. He couldn't choose between what parking spot. So Damasio said, there is something going on here that we don't understand. There is a biological basis for decision making. And those philosophers were wrong in trying to separate
the mind and the body.
The mind and the body. It is not possible to do that. So he then ended up writing Descartes' Error to say, we don't understand this. There's a very, very deep, abiding connection between what goes on in our body and in our brain. And trying to separate them leaves us in deep trouble.
Okay, I'm processing this. I have heard this story, actually. I don't remember when, probably a long time ago. So, choice. How do you understand where choice comes from then? Because he can't make a choice. He's faced with choices and can't make them. I mean, you're non-functional then. You're basically like this floating vapor in the world.
Absolutely. And so if you can't make a choice, if you can't make a decision, let's just backtrack for a moment. When the prefrontal cortex gets really tired, you mentioned earlier when you've had a day of a lot of cognitive, busyness. You've had to make a lot of decisions. You've been looking at different things, analyzing things. You come to the end of the day, you can't make a decision. The reason that happens is because the prefrontal cortex no longer has the energy to do that. And so there was a lot of research that was involved with that. Baumeister did research into that. But I think one of the reasons that research fell foul of people looking at it, because he used the word willpower. And willpower denoted some kind of moral capacity or moral incapacity. And it wasn't actually the case at all. He was actually looking at prefrontal cortex energy capacity, but he didn't realize he was doing that. This was many years ago. So when the brain gets really, really tired, what it does, it either makes a knee-jerk response, like a habitual response. So it'll grab that box of chocolates when you're really hungry.
Is that a default? Is that
yes, it's a default.
So it's like the prefrontal cortex or executive functions. Like I'm exhausted.
Yeah.
Hey, like autopilot guys, can you just decide this for me because I can't deal with it.
Absolutely. It either does that or it makes no decision. So what happens when people get really tired? So I always say to people, when I work with groups of people, I deal with
this all the time.
I say to them, don't have a meeting at the end of the day where you have to make important decisions. Because if you do that, you'll either make a habitual response, and we'll get back to this because this is also about explore and exploit. And this is under extreme stress what the brain does. Or otherwise, it'll do nothing. It'll sit back and it'll go, I can't make a decision. And you know what that feels like as well. You go to a place at the end of a day and you have to make a decision. And I can't do that. And this is the prefrontal cortex being unable to make that decision, make that choice. We know that this is all interconnected with what we've chosen before, with what the context we're in, the environment that we're in, the people that we trust in that environment, whether we've had a good night's sleep, whether we're depressed or anxious. So all of these choices come down to how we feel within ourselves, whether we're comfortable with making that decision, and also in relation to whether we've made the decision before. So you mentioned gut earlier. We make a decision based on our gut.
Yeah, Dave, the other quote, and I've referenced this quite a bit. I'm actually thinking about it like this morning because I was listening to videos about the Romantic era, as one would do, and David Hume, who's a philosopher, sort of proto-economist that I happen to like, sort of buddies with Adam Smith. He has this quote that's something like, reason will always be a slave of the passions, and it ought to be that's not just an is, but kind of an ought, like it's good, And for an Enlightenment thinker, that's kind of a weird thing to assert, that reason should be a slave to the passions and it has no other station but that. But it does seem like maybe he was on pretty solid neurobiological grounds with that claim, or at least that they're connected in a way that this isn't like pure hyper robot rationality. A pure hyper robot can't make decisions.
It can't. And that's one of the problems we're dealing with in today's world. The decisions that are being made by large language models and AI are not based on a true experience of what being human is all about. So there's so many ways we could go with this discussion, but let's just stick with this feeling of knowing again. I just want to get back to that. Because yes, he is right, but there is a real role for cognition and deep critical thinking. And so we can't say, well, because emotions are part of the way we think, we must go with emotion all the time. That's a bad path as well. We must be able to say, okay, we feel this way about something, but the facts are telling us this, and we may not feel nice about it, but this is what reality is showing us, and this is what reality is asserting. So we need to keep both of these capacities functional, but we need to know when to use them. And that's something that I think we've lost focus of in society generally. So we will come back to that. But I just want to mention this feeling of knowing again, because one of the things that researchers have also discovered, and I just call this the scanning effect, is when we can access information online really, really quickly, the brain starts believing that it is already our knowledge. So they've done this in some interesting experiments. They've said to people...
Already our knowledge.
Yes, that we actually understand this deeply. So you'll find people espousing on the internet, on LinkedIn about this particular topic, and you look at it and you go, you don't understand this very deeply because you've made all of these mistakes. But because they can access the information very quickly, they start believing that they have become experts in the topic. And this is a real problem.
I'm probably guilty of this plenty.
I think
I try not to be, but I probably that one hits home.
John,
but keep going.
John, every brain is susceptible to this. It's not that there are some brains that are more susceptible. It's that every brain is susceptible. It's something about the way we access the information, the speed of accessing the information, and knowing that it's there that makes the brain think it's an extension of the brain. And
oh, interesting.
You see, now that's another example of the feeling of knowing. You feel that you know this thing and you feel that it's a fact about reality and that it's real knowledge, but it actually isn't. It's just a feeling that you have. Now,
okay, so I'm thinking about this because we are in this world that has the pattern recognition.
yes.
So my son Mateo, and he's doing this less as he gets older, I'm noticing, but he would sometimes, we'd be having these philosophical, political conversations at the home, in our house, and he'd say something, and I'm like, yep, that ultimately is just a bunch of communism. That's me. That's what I would say. And for routine viewers of the show, they're like, yeah, it sounds like you, Popola. Including stuff like trans talk, which I want to get to because that the biological differences of in the brain are where I'd like to get to soon in our conversation. But he's like, "What are you talking about, Dad? Why is it? What's that have to do with communism?" I'm like, no, you got to understand this blank slate mentality. Like, and I construct a narrative that I would stand by actually right now, but I can feel that I am prone towards wanting coherence and can construct stories to achieve that coherence in a way that's just confirmation bias. So I see the world, I see complex events, I don't know all the details, and the details I do know quickly snap together into a story that matches things I already believe. Is that part of what's going on here with this feeling of knowing, we see a shooter, we see the shooter of Charlie Kirk, and then we get a couple pieces of information, and it's like, that's some crazy left-wing trans weirdo, got it. Okay, left-winger's bad, got it. Is that what's happening? Is it kicking in preconceived, stored info to find the pattern that connects? What's going on?
The brain is a pattern detection organ. It has to do that. We had to find patterns so that we could predict the best possibility for us to survive in an environment. So yes, that is part of what the brain does to save energy. Because if you had to sit down with every single thing that confronts you in the day and think deeply about what it means and how it happened, you would never do anything. You'd be paralyzed. So the brain has got these shortcuts, these heuristics, which is a mental shortcut to get to a point because that makes sense of the world. When that shortcut goes wrong, that's what we end up with as a bias, which is a confirmation bias, which is what you're talking about. And we do need a sense of coherence in the world because part of that internal coherence allows us to be with our tribe members where we feel safe and secure. So confirmation bias has actually got a role to play in us feeling like we're safe in the world, the social cohesion, that we are with our people and we are safe with our people.
Well, I think about it at the most basic level of trust, that everything relies on trust ultimately. And trust is a form of calorie savings, right? It's like, yes. I understand what you are because of some pattern recognition or because we've got some prior dealings and I'm relying on those to feel like we can do another deal together and you're not going to screw me.
Absolutely.
And so we can't cognitively do every transaction that way. We can't write out a long form agreement for every choice we make and then each read all the fine print and sign. That would be impossible. Life would completely stop. So we have to trust each other, and that's about patterns and prediction.
Yes.
Like, will you fulfill the thing that you're saying you're going to do? Do we actually understand? Do we have a meeting of the minds, like from a legal perspective? Do we actually agree
Yes.
on the thing we're saying we agree on, such that when we go off and act, it'll be predictable? That all feels like super, like the only way society functions.
But that worked really, really well before the world was as complex as it is. But now the world is a lot more complex, and we've all co-created this complexity. We can blame a handful of people, and we can discuss how they've influenced this. But if we didn't have a way to make sense of the world really quickly, we would really battle, because there's so much information out there. So we look at the information, and as you said, we quickly tick the boxes. That confirmation bias kicks in because of neural energy and because of the amount of information we have available. The feeling of knowing is a little bit different, because the feeling of knowing rises in us even if we know absolutely nothing about a situation. Okay, we know nothing about it. We just get this feeling of knowing. So I'll come back to this because it's a really important point. Sometimes when people have an anesthetic experience, sometimes they speak about a deep spiritual experience during that. And it's a very, very real
anesthesia, anesthetic experience of being knocked out for getting your teeth pulled, or
people can say it. They had a huge spiritual experience. Now, for them, it's 100% real. They have a feeling of knowing, but it was only chemicals in their brain. The same thing happens with some psychedelic experiences. The same thing can happen to a person if they're sitting in a cathedral. That sense of awe stimulates their autonomic nervous system, stimulates a release of adrenaline and dopamine and a sense of security, which is where serotonin comes in. So they'll have a deep spiritual experience in the church and they'll feel that they were touched by God. But it is a feeling of knowing. It is a chemical reaction that's occurring within the brain. And this is not something that happened before. So there's no confirmation bias to this unless it happens regularly.
Okay.
Then you can say, okay, I'm confirming this because I've had a sense of this before. But the feeling of knowing is someone that's never been faced with any information before, but they immediately jump to a feeling about this. Okay. Now, this is where it becomes dangerous in today's society, because if you've never heard anything about a particular thing, but you've got this particular worldview, you will immediately jump to, I feel I know what this is all about, even if you don't. And that's a very dangerous thing to have in an environment where so many things are happening that are all happening at the same time. And there's a huge complexity to most issues. But we jump to that because of these habits that our brain has now established. Because without that, how do you function? So sometimes people have said to me, so what is the function of this feeling of knowing? If it's such a bad thing, why do we have it? Now, we have to have some sense of whether something is worth pursuing or not. So someone comes to you with a business idea that you've never, ever encountered before, and you have absolutely no frame of reference to understand this, but somehow you just get a feeling about it. Now, without that feeling, you wouldn't be able to make a decision. So this is a very important part of our physiology, or our neurophysiology, our body and brain working together. But we need to also make 100% sure that we keep on checking on it. So I loved what you said earlier, where you talk to your son and you can see yourself jumping to that confirmation bias. You're actually watching your brain do that because your brain is comfortable doing that. We need to become just as good at judging this feeling of knowing, so that we ask ourselves a question. Now, why am I having this feeling? What does it actually mean? Now, you mentioned gut response earlier. So I just want to touch on that, because Daniel Kahneman believed very strongly in not trusting your gut reaction unless there were a few things in place.
Okay, lay that out, because the other piece of the gut that I think about is the work of Haidt and like the elephant and the rider, and that intuition has it's not just random, but there's a purpose to it. But yeah, so Kahneman, lay it out.
So he said that you should trust this gut reaction, this feeling that you have, if you have some things that have happened in the past that have let you know that this gut feeling is true. So for example, the example he gives is playing chess. So when you play chess, you know that these particular moves always result in that. And so you can pretty much trust that gut reaction because you know that this has happened before and you've seen it happen before. The other thing you've got to be very aware of is the framing effect. So who told you this and under what conditions? So if that has been pretty stable and you know that the outcome is always the same, trust that gut feeling.
So for example, to pull from the headlines of the past, if you have, I don't know, gone to a little simulation at the Aspen Institute in which people of authority say we should be on the lookout for Russian disinformation and train you on this, and then 2 weeks later, Hunter Biden's laptop shows up in a news article, and you've been primed to expect Russian information to look exactly like Hunter Biden's laptop, which is what happened with Twitter and the Twitter takedown of Hunter Biden's laptop. And that actually happened. Authorities at Aspen primed people in the tech community and the media to expect exactly the thing that happened, even though those people that were doing that knew it was real. But that happened. That they were primed for it. They were like, "Oh, this is the thing. This is the feeling of knowing was this must be Russian misinformation because I know I've been told exactly what this is going to feel like," and click.
Spot on. Because what the brain does, what it can grasp, the fastest and the easiest, it will take as the truth. And that was fast and easy, wasn't it? They had just been exposed to it. Their brain was primed. It was there in their recent memory. And they said, yes, that's it. So that's what we call the recency effect. It happened so recently. And you see, then we also have the illusory truth effect, which is another little quirk that the brain does. The more often you see something, the more the brain believes it's true. So if I say to you over and over and over again, hey, John, there's a little purple person that lives under your couch. And this is obviously an extreme, ridiculous example. If I say this to you over and over and over again, you're eventually going to go, wow, isn't that the case? Now, this is what happens with the news. You see something over and over, and it may not be true, but your brain says, I'm starting to believe this, and eventually the brain does believe this.
There was a Star Trek The Next Generation episode in which Captain Picard is captured by the Cardassians. I think it's Cardassians. The problem is, I'm a Trekker, but the Kardashians has scrambled that word in my mind permanently. But I think it's Cardassians, and he is tortured. And one of the torture programs that happens is he's brought in, there's bright lights, and I forget how many lights are there. There's 3 or there's 2, but the torturer says, how many lights do you see? Do you see? And Picard says 2, let's just say 2, and there's 2. And he gets zapped. And it's like, no, there's 3. And it's like, and he refuses to lie along the way. But this is repeated over and over. It's really kind of a brutal bit of 90s television. And at the end, at the conclusion, when he's back safe on the Enterprise and he's confiding either with Mr. Data or Beverly or the number 1, he says, towards the end, I saw 3 lights. I actually could see the 3 lights. And that it's I know it's fictional, but I think that was drawing on work done about torture and about the changes in the brain. But so is that what's going on there?
Well, you see something long enough and you are told that thing long enough, you have to believe that it's true. Because if you don't believe that it's true, it means you have to keep on fighting your own belief system. You have to keep on fighting yourself. And one of the things we want to do as humans, we want to be coherent. If we aren't coherent and if we don't explain ourselves to ourselves and have the capacity to explain ourselves to other people, we can't carry on in the world. And if you can't explain yourself well to yourself and to the people that you live with and the people that you communicate with and the people that you work with, eventually you can't work with those people because they would say, nothing that person does seems to tie up with what they did in the past and what they're planning for the future. That person is unstable. So we have this deep desire to maintain this coherence. And that's why we have confirmation bias and disconfirmation bias, why we have to keep ourselves on this really careful path and why it's so difficult for us to change our minds, which brings us to the affective tipping point, which is also part of this discussion because...
Well, before we get to that, though, you had talked about that there were conditions that Kahneman thought were necessary for the feeling of knowing to be validated.
Yes.
So one that you said was are you responding to something that you have a history of actually understanding?
And that it's actually happened before in that way.
So that's very specific conditions.
Very, very specific.
Chess isn't reality. Chess is like a very simple set of rules on a finite board. And that's not life. That's not the way life works. That's about as simple a game as you can get. Well, checkers would be simpler, but still.
Yes.
What else? What else do we need to bind our feeling of knowing around to have confidence in it?
He said the other thing, as I said, is this a recent thing that has just come into my world and into my life? And am I grabbing that recent thing? Now, the reason that's important is because you require less neural energy to grab that recent thing. You used the laptop as an example, versus going back and say, hold on a second, maybe it's not that. You need more neural energy to do that. So it's much easier to say, it's that, and run with that. He said, if you have that feeling that you're grabbing that thing and saying, that's the thing, that may not be true. So don't trust that feeling. Don't trust it. And the other thing, of course, is to say, is this an objective reality? I think that I put my coffee mug on that shelf. Now, if you go there and you find your coffee mug there, that is objective reality. So he said, always check in with that as well. So he's given these very strict conditions for when you should and shouldn't trust your gut feeling. So whenever I hear people saying, oh no, I follow my gut, I go, well, yeah, you need to be careful about doing that. Because one of the things that we do, and this is how we make sure that our sense of coherence stays stable, is we nudge the past to fit into what we think we want the future to look like and what makes us comfortable. So,
well, that draws on what you'd said earlier about the stories that people told about their light bulb moment were at least half wrong.
Absolutely.
Maybe more. I can't remember the math exactly, but it was like quite a bit of it was wrong. I think it's also the case that eyewitness testimony is remarkably unreliable.
Absolutely. And that's 100%, John. And the reason the researchers were curious about this, it wasn't just that memory is fallible. I think we know that now. Our memories change according to what we're experiencing now, what's happened between that and the memory. It's the confidence that the people feel in their testimony. So there's something called the weapon focus effect. And they know this from witnesses who have been involved in a situation where there's been a weapon. The person is so focused on the weapon that they regularly and consistently get the details about the person holding the weapon wrong.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about this.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that's once again the feeling of knowing. But they're very, very confident in their recollection, even though it's completely wrong. So there is the feeling of knowing again. That example, that's my handwriting, but that's not what happened, is the perfect feeling for this.
There's a video I watched that pointed to some other work. Some of it might have been Kahneman, or it might have been someone whose name sounds very similar, about the fact that, or at least the observation that high IQ people tend to get themselves wrapped around absolute batshit ideas. That actually high IQ are more likely to have this feeling of knowing and high degrees of confidence about stuff that's total nonsense, like completely crazy. And it's like, what? Like, why is that? Why would someone that's got fast processing and high cognitive capability be more prone towards radical nonsense, for example? In we see this in our politics, right? Who are the people that are voting for Mamdani, who calls himself a socialist and really is functionally a communist when you listen to him? We've run a lot of experiments on that ideology. That dog doesn't hunt. But his core of his base are the well-educated cognitive elite.
Well, there are a few things in here, and I think Rob Henderson's luxury beliefs definitely comes into this.
Yeah.
But the other thing that happens to people when people are really wealthy, they tend to think that they are smarter than they maybe are. And this is simply because other people bow down to them. Other people don't argue with them. Other people say, well, that's really interesting. And they may go away and say, that is a ridiculous idea. But they don't say it to their face. So they end up with this belief that they're smarter than they are.
So sort of like a sycophancy.
Absolutely. But there's something else that I think you're referring to, and I think they actually have a term for this. It's called Nobel laureatus.
Yes.
Yes. Where people who have won Nobel Prizes and are super, super smart in a particular area then think that they're super smart in other areas as well. And they're shown to be very fallible in those areas. So I think there's a belief in intellect that if you know a lot about something, then you need to know, then you think you need to know about a lot of other things. And I think our ego gets involved in that.
Like Neil deGrasse Tyson opining about gender ideology and sounding like an absolute like imbecile. Just like you haven't thought about this for more than 10 minutes. Why are you even talking about it?
The problem is that nobody's saying that to him because they respect his intellect in another area. And so that person is falling foul of their own intellect and falling foul of the people around them. And so once again, the balance, John, we need to be able to ask ourselves, why are we thinking a certain way? We need to be able to clarify what that feeling of knowing is. We need to be able to think critically. And that's one of the things you and I have discussed, before this show. We discussed the lack of critical thinking. And I mentioned earlier, the capacity to feel, to emote is very important, is involved in decision making and in the way we think. But critical thinking has to be part of what we do because we need to know when emotion is driving us. You see, part of the problem we have is that emotions travel significantly faster in the brain versus cognition.
Is this part of Kahneman's thinking fast and slow? It's been a while since I've read that.
It is.
Because it seems like even the framing you were talking about like, okay, we have this feeling. All right, let me check that. Have I experienced this exact situation before so that I can really rely on that feeling? Not exactly. Does it look a lot like something that happened recently? So maybe that's sort of tilting me towards this feeling. Maybe. And then what was the third one that was?
There's an objective reality.
Yeah. Okay. So can I another way to think about that could be like, can I falsify this feeling?
Yes.
Like, can I go and verify this is or isn't happening?
Correct.
Like, where did I leave my keys? I can go look. Oh, I didn't leave them there. The feeling is wrong.
100% right.
Those are really narrow criteria in a world that involves a lot of choices that are not so obvious like that. So it seems like what it's saying is, hey, those are all thinking fast criteria.
Thinking slow takes more neural energy.
So thinking slow, is that where we get into critical thinking?
Yes.
And what is critical thinking to you? What does that mean?
It means not going with the first response. It means asking the kinds of questions that maybe leave you uncomfortable. It means saying things to get someone to admit to things that maybe they're not comfortable with. It means doing a deep dive into history and saying, okay, this has happened in the past. Is this likely to happen in the future? So you start asking a whole lot of questions and you start listening actively, which we mentioned before you started the show, which is what most people don't do naturally. Most people, when they are busy speaking, are speaking, and the other person is listening, but already priming what they're going to respond to that person who is speaking. Whereas what you talk about, active listening and deep listening, is you are listening to my words. You are not conjuring up or imagining what you're going to say to me, which is why you sit back and you look up and you go, okay, let me think about that and think about how I want to respond. Now, we live in a world that honors and supports fast responses, what you call hot cognition. That is
hot takes.
Hot takes, yes. Listen to this 20-second soundbite that's going to solve every single problem that you've ever encountered in your whole life. Yeah. And the brain is primed for that because the brain is always looking to save neural energy. So if I can give you something really quick, then you're going to definitely go for that and you're going to become used to doing that versus sitting back and going, hold on a second, is this just crap? Or is there really some substance to this? What are we doing in schools? Are we teaching children to sit back and ask a question? Now, our children went to an international baccalaureate school for their last 3 years of their education, and they have a subject there called theory of knowledge. And the theory of knowledge is saying to them, how do you know this thing? That's what it asked them. How do you know this thing? So these children, our children, when they were doing this, they would come home and we would have these huge discussions at the dinner table. And of course, I was throwing in the neuroscience. Well, hold on a second. Your prefrontal cortex isn't fully formed yet. So you're very idealistic and you're not thinking about the consequences and so on. And they would get so frustrated with me. I'd say to them, buds, they're still buds. And just as a side note, my son said to me a couple of years ago, he said, Mom, I know that my prefrontal cortex is developing. And I said, how do you know this thing? I was like, this is so exciting. And he said, because I think more about the consequences of what I'm doing that I've done before.
It's very interesting to hear you say that, because I am going through this moment now with my oldest son, with Matteo. We had an experience, a conversation of this sort very recently, where he was reflecting on himself. And he said, basically, I am not living up to my potential. I've been taking the easy way out because I feel like he's a pretty smart kid. And he's like, I've sort of done what needed to be done in school up till now and haven't really been challenged. And I want to be challenged now. And it was like, wow, this is exactly tracking. It's like, yep, he's in his 20s now. So now there's this stuff that's starting to happen that as a parent, you're hoping is going to happen, right? Especially if you have a kid that you think's pretty smart. You're like, please get your act together. I'm not saying he doesn't have his act together, but in some cases he doesn't, and neither did I. It's like, I think about like, oh, he's really messy, and then I think about my apartment in college, and I'm like, I was a disgusting pig. And it's like, well, why was that? I'm pretty conscientious now. How did I get there? There's this thing that's become popular that I've heard a lot, that 25, 26 is right around the time when this executive function is sort of not done baking, but has exited a phase of development that's important and is now kind of like you got your full tool set at your disposal. Is this true?
Yes, it is true. But just to make it a little bit more detailed, it seems to happen a little bit earlier for women. And that seems to track with our evolutionary progress. So if a woman had a child, she needed to be able to think a little bit further into the future than the man whose brain stops, PFC is fully formed at about age 27. So 23, 24 for women, about 27 for men. And obviously there are variations. Our daughter would tell us regularly that hers was fully formed when she was 21. And it wasn't, but yes, that was her belief. So that is important, and it doesn't mean that the brain is fully developed up until that point. It just means that it has been, it's primed then to then start building on top of that. So you will find as your son gets closer to that 27, he'll start thinking a lot more about the future.
Oh, well, and just even for myself, I mean, I'm 48 and going back 20 years and thinking about what I was in my late 20s, transitioning into 30s. It is very much transitioned into an entirely different way of understanding yourself.
It is.
And I had the benefit at the time of becoming a dad at 28. So I was like primed and excited to be a real adult. I was like my own, I've told this story here before, that like when my son was born, it was this transformational moment that is probably, that also like I was primed for neurobiologically, I guess, to put my own ego in second place to being in service of my son and my family. And that was actually liberating, because if you are remotely ambitious, your biggest enemy, in my opinion, is often your own expectations for yourself, which you'll never quite meet because you set these goals and you're never meeting them. No. And so then you create this, what I think of as a kind of fear of failure thing that happens. And that's very paralyzing. So, I feel like even the notion of golden handcuffs in the corporate environment, that's a fear of failure. Like not leaving a job to start something that you want to do or to do something different because you've got golden handcuffs is a fear of failure mode. And I felt like I was like liberated from that when my son was born, which is weird because no one talks about it that way. No one talks about it like having kids will set you free. But that's exactly what happened for me. And this has given me another way of thinking about what that moment was, because I was right around 28. And I think that's been the median age for becoming a parent was around 25, 26, like between 25 and 28. Now it's shifting older.
Yes.
In ways that are horrendous and destructive to the society, and fertility is falling into a non-replacement level. But that seems kind of old. When we think of like human history, we hear this thing that that people didn't live very long, but then Moses and stuff lived real long, and like Benjamin Franklin was in his 80s. So how do these markers in time in neurological development, how do they track against the pre-industrial age of human evolution? Like, were we really only living to 35? Because that's not a whole lot of time to have your prefrontal cortex fully developed.
No, it isn't. And that's a big question. So,
or was it like some of us were living to 80 and then the rest were getting killed by tigers, and so the average gets shifted low?
I think the average definitely was shifted. But I think that part of the reason that we managed to extend our lifespan was because of our prefrontal cortex. Once we figured things out and we got pretty good at figuring out how to keep ourselves safe and not to press that nuclear button and so on and so forth.
For now.
And also to optimize our nutrition, which we probably did by default, not by design. We ended up having a much longer lifespan. And so that's given us benefits, but it's also given us negatives, because now we have an aging population with a younger workforce that may be feeling resentful. There are all sorts of ramifications that come with that. But a fully functioning brain is a wonderful thing. And when it can be primed to think critically, to be creative, and to use emotions when they're required, we could create a pretty good world for ourselves. But we're not teaching the youngsters to put emotion into context. So what I say to people, emotions are messages. They're not necessarily directives. What we see online is people responding, that hot cognition, that emotional response. They'll get behind, a comment and they'll respond instantly, which is a very emotional response. They're not sitting back. I think part of the problem is that people that respond very quickly from an emotional perspective are the ones out there spreading their emotional contagion, if I can put it that way. Whereas those of us that think a little bit more, that are a bit more contemplative, take a bit longer to respond and then decide, what the hell, I don't even need to respond to that. It's just nonsense. So we are not teaching a younger generation how the brain actually functions so that they can say, okay, under these conditions, it's great that I use my emotions because my emotions need to be the driving force here. Under other circumstances, I really need to just sit back and think about this a lot. I need to actually consider this. And I think your son is getting to that point, and this is what the prefrontal cortex, the gift of the prefrontal cortex is. It says, hold on a second, is this really necessary? If I do this, what's going to happen in the long run? How do I actually know this thing? Now, if you don't know how your brain functions, and we didn't need to know so much about brain function in the past. I think we need to know a lot more about it today to be able to navigate our way through all the complexity that we have. So knowing about the feeling of knowledge, the feeling of knowing is a very important thing to know today, because am I responding? Is this just a knee-jerk reaction and I actually know absolutely nothing about this, but I have this preconceived idea? Am I smart in one area, but I'm not necessarily smart in this area? Is this serving me or not? Is this serving my community? Is this serving the society at large? These are not questions that we are asking children to investigate. And one of the reasons that is happening is because in schools, there is a framework called social emotional learning. And social emotional learning, Abigail Schreier writes about this in her book, Bad Therapy, frames everything that the child is experiencing in the school environment in relation to their emotions. So how do you feel about math? Are you worried about it? Have you heard that it's a really difficult subject? Have you heard that someone else had a problem with the subject. So the child starts this adventure into this new subject already anxious. Instead of saying, hey, you came to school on a bus today, you drove over a bridge, did you see that huge building? Without math, none of that would exist. Instead of making it exciting. Now, the problem with that is that the brain cannot be in an affective state of emotion, and a cognitive state at the same time.
Really?
If you are being chased by a tiger, and I say to you, hey, John, I'm going to give you the principles of calculus now. It's not going to work, is it? No.
Well, is it, but is that being chased by a tiger versus being excited?
That's a very different feeling. Anxiety and stress is a state of vigilance and a state of needing safety quickly. This is not the same as saying, hey, John, you know what? Maths can be challenging because it requires you to think really deeply about something. But hey, without this table, without maths, this table wouldn't exist. That's very different. That's a feeling of excitement. I want to learn about this thing. It's going to help me in my life. I'm going to find out how the world functions. I'm now more curious about things. When I go home on the bus, I'm going to look at the bridges. I'm going to look at the buildings. I'm going to think differently. That's not a state of high arousal. What has happened in schools, children are asked to frame whatever is going on in the world in relation to how they feel about that. So they are asked what's happening at home. And this was all set up for a really good reason. So let me just say that all the best intentions in the world, unfortunately, don't make up for poor judgment. Because
the road to hell is paved with good intentions,
it is.
As our grandparents told us.
When policies are set in place, not understanding how the brain functions, this can lead to a disaster. And I think in many situations, this is what has happened in schools, because there will be a small percentage of children in a classroom that are dealing with difficult challenges at home. Parents that are addicts, a difficult divorce, maybe poverty, maybe hunger. All of those things will influence how the child feels. But it's not every child that is experiencing that. But what happens with this particular framework of teaching, the whole class is subjected to this, how do you feel? How are you starting your day? Not, hey, this is what we're going to learn today, and it's so exciting. And this is going to help you because this is going to give you a different perspective on this new thing that you're going to discover or that you're curious about. The way the Acton school system does. This is an exciting thing to discover. It's now saying it's starting off from this emotional perspective. And so
so I want to make sure I'm understanding when you use emotional in this context for social emotional learning, because I consider excitement and enthusiasm to also be emotions.
Yes.
So is there a palette of emotions that, as in the way you understand it, that are in different, like satisfaction, pleasure versus pain versus anxiety? These things we think of these are emotions. Like I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm angry, I'm excited, I'm nervous. So that fight or flight anxiety is an intense emotion that's not, but being super excited about your class because you feel like you're going to get an A in the test, or because it's just your favorite class. That's also an emotion. So is emotions too broad a word for what we're talking about?
I think what's happened, the emotion that has taken over in schools, it's more about the negative emotions. So if you're feeling stressed or you're feeling anxious or you're upset, that has been the focus. It hasn't been a focus on what are you excited about today? What did you learn at home that was wonderful? What happened last night that made you happy? That hasn't been the focus. It's been a focus on what is leading you to feel distressed. That's the problem.
How much of that, we start our conversation with your transition out of clinical psychology. And, my wife and I adopted recently a teenager. And as part of that process, we had to go through like 30 plus hours of trauma training. And Pervin and the body keeps the score. Yeah. And the thing that I was struck by is that it seems like multiple things are true. It seems like traumatic experiences of broken bonds, especially at early ages, which Erica Komisar, who's a psychotherapist that's been on the show, has talked about a lot. Like she talks about the centrality of bonding with your children as a mother.
Yes.
In age like 1 to 3 especially, and that like if you don't do that, then you really leave really deep scars that might not really be fully able to be resolved. But there's all these other things that are trauma. And there's a lot of focus on trauma. And our language today is all about trauma and PTSD and being triggered, which is a PTSD term. And all this stuff is all trauma. And then, so that seems like, so I guess my first question is that trauma obsession what has driven the focus on negative emotions and anxiety in social emotional learning from you? Like, is that what informs the focus?
Not from what I can gather, but I think it has added to it, because social emotional learning was introduced into classrooms a long time ago. It's not a recent development. What you're speaking about in relation to trauma is more like concept creep. Now, concept creep refers to how a word, a negative connotation or a negative phrase, has been stretched. So now that it means more than it originally was intended to mean. Yeah. And it's always in a downward
Someone having
spiral.
An opinion that I don't like is now traumatic.
Absolutely. So when we speak about trauma and, the body keeps the score, is true to the degree of the trauma. And a lot of that research was taken from severely traumatized people and then extrapolated to normal trauma, normal life, normal situations of being a human being, which are not always pleasant. And, stubbing your toe against a table is not equivalent to surviving the Holocaust. And I think that's part of the problem that has happened. And I think therapy with the lens on trauma continuously I think it's actually caused what is termed iatrogenic harm. I think some people go to therapy. Iatrogenic harm is where you introduce a harm into a supposedly beneficial experience. And it was used originally in situations like surgery and hospital stays.
Yeah.
So
there's a lot of harm that's inescapable. Like you're cutting the body, it's literally causing harm inescapably with that case.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, what happens when you go into therapy and the therapist has got a particular lens and you didn't see your trauma as so bad, but someone convinced you to go to therapy, and now suddenly you say, oh, wow, I've had a terrible life and I'm such a victim. So that is iatrogenic harm. That person walked in there without such a huge problem, and now they've got a huge problem as they walk out.
Well, one of the things that there's the two elements of like my understanding of reality that have cut against this, even on the personal level of trying to like think about how to be a good adoptive parent for somebody who has had experiences that I can't even fully know, and is like, well, it sure seems like most of human history was really traumatic, like really brutal all the time. Like being a Native American sucked real bad. Like we find the records of we find like skulls and they're marred with scars because it was really like life. Hobbes was right, Rousseau was wrong. Like there isn't a noble savage. No. Life was brutish and short. So we're still here, despite the fact that all of human history has been monstrously brutal and scarred by war and travesty. And then even more recent history is still pretty brutal and horrible. And in fact, there's these weird things that happen, like suicide rates go down during times of war.
Yes.
And in America, and I know like I'm a right-winger, I'm broadly for America more pro-immigration than most of my friends in general, legal immigration. And part of the reason is I look at immigrants in this country, including my own great-grandparents, and say, I mean, you're an immigrant to America. But I say, like, man, these are some pretty awesome people. I like the Mexican Americans I know, many of whom are first-generation immigrants here. They're pretty awesome. And their lives have been really hard. But they're not hobbled by it. They're actually, like, doing, like, the and I'm monologuing here, I know I do this sometimes, but this is one of the things that's this big counter to this theory of trauma stuff that we're just bombarded by, is some of the people I know who have actually truly lived hard lives are so much more mentally healthy and stable and adult and stoic and functional than these coddled, rich little children that are in their 20s that act like big babies and have emotional reactions to everything and claim to be traumatized by words. And it's like, why is it that Nigerians in Texas make more than everybody? Because their life wasn't great. They came here to escape a life that wasn't great, and they're doing great. And you're saying you're like Claudine Gay. You're saying you're traumatized, and you are a silver spoon kid. Shut up. I know. Close quote on my rant, but it just seems like that's real. Like, so how do you understand? Pick that apart.
No. I can't pick it apart. The challenge we have that is, if I tell you that your life is unfair, and I tell you that things are really tough, and I tell you that the world is an uncertain place, and the climate is changing, and politics are bad, and everything is going to hell in a handbasket, what do? You start internalizing it. You start saying, wow, that's true. I am a victim. Life is bad. It was much better for my forefathers than it is for me. And so you start internalizing it. And it's not happening when your brain is fully formed. So you can't say, hold on a second, is that actually true? It's happening while your brain is busy developing. And so you develop these neural pathways for, hey, life is tough. That was a traumatic experience when my teacher didn't give me an A+. When my friends, canceled me because I wore a stupid Halloween costume or whatever, that was trauma. And why do I know that it was trauma? Because the teacher said to me, you look like you're troubled today. And I was. Or otherwise, I said to my mother, I'm having a really bad day and I need to take a mental health day. And my mother said, of course, let's do that. So we cannot blame this generation entirely. They did not do this themselves.
No, I feel like they are victimized in this sense for sure.
We created an educational system that underpins the way they look at the world. Then we created an environment where they could go and share their emotions freely with strangers all over the world and get feedback via a like button. And now we're telling them, don't feel anything about this. We can't expect that from them. What we can do is teach them about how the brain functions, and for them to say to themselves, I feel very anxious now. I got a response I didn't like. That person said a thing I didn't like. I watched the news or I saw the social media post and I felt bad. It made me feel distressed. But you know what? I know that that's a chemical reaction. It's going to move through my body 30, 60, 90 seconds. I'm going to take a really deep breath and I'm going to let it go. What can I go and do now? Because the one thing that we haven't taught them is that action. Look, there are a lot of things we haven't taught them, but the one thing that we know counteracts this immersion in emotion and trauma and feeling, what we call our emotions, is action. And one of the interesting things that we've discovered is that when young people go out and volunteer, their mental health goes up.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a wonderful thing to see, because that tells us going out into the world and making a difference, looking at how other people have experienced the world, seeing it in context.
Well, and volunteering when it's doing something that's physically productive, as opposed to volunteering by soaking in your victimhood narrative as an activist, is not, I imagine those have two different effects.
Absolutely.
Like, this isn't volunteering.
No, it absolutely isn't. Volunteering is making the world a better place by improving the quality of someone else's life. That's what volunteering is. And suddenly, guess what happens? Okay, just a little aside. We have vision, we have this visual system. Think of it as visual system number one, where you're looking down, okay? You're looking at your present moment. You're looking at what's happening right now in your immediate surroundings. And this is what your focus is, on this immediate, the now, yeah. We have visual system 2, which is looking up, looking at the horizon. Guess what? The world's a big place. This is my role in the world. I am not the center of the universe. I can see that there are things further away from me and things closer to me. I can see that I have a role to play in that bigger world. Where do we spend most of our time now? 90% of our time is spent here, in the here and now. So we're basically doing a whole lot of navel gazing, whether it's via our phone, via our computers, via the way we respond to people. And so our focus is very, very limited to this now, this moment. When we look up, our perspective changes. I had a lecturer once who said this one phrase, and it has stuck with me for all these years. He said, a mood disorder is often a lack of movement disorder. So when you're out there in the world and you are living your life and you are doing things and you are moving forward and you are actively changing your circumstances, you see the world differently. You are not focused on yourself all the time. And, when we first met, we spoke about meaning, the importance of meaning. When you find meaning, your perspective shifts, and it's not just I. Most people have become I specialists. Whereas when you go out into the world and you're doing things, suddenly you have more meaning. And meaning is important because we are community creatures. When we are focused on visual system 1, we are not community creatures anymore. We are not part of a community. Just because it's an online community does not mean we are in person communicating with people.
This is a question I have. So I'm here. I'm in visual system 1, trying to focus. But this piece of glass is sort of like a window. And I can put it up here, and I feel like I'm looking out into the world. And in a certain kind of synthetic sense, I am looking out into the world.
In an abstract sense.
How do our brains understand that experience of looking through this black mirror, this piece of glass, and seeing things that are the world, but aren't really the world, like going outside or being in a physical place? Are we interpreting that as if it's different? It's not like the distinctions here are blurred because of the screen. Are they not? Or how should I think about that?
Our brain is trying to make sense of it. It's a sense-making organ. It's trying to figure out what to do. Now, the closest I can come to answering that question is to give you 2 examples. And the first one is some research that was done. And they had a look at how the brains of children light up when they are talking to their mothers in person versus via a screen.
Like a Zoom call.
Via a Zoom call. And they discovered that the child's brain lights up in about 9 different places, between 7 to 9 places, when the child is engaged with the mother in person. But when it's doing it via Zoom, via this window, this screen, only one area of the brain is highlighted, is active. Huh. Now, the reason that happens is because while you and I are speaking here, you're picking up on all the tiny little intonations on my face. You're looking at my eyes. You're looking at whether I'm smiling. You're looking at how I'm moving my hands. You're looking at all of these things from a subconscious perspective, and your brain is picking up things in relation to that. When you're doing it via a screen, you can't see that.
Well, and that makes me think, I have a background in computer graphics and animation, 3D. And there's this term that I think, as most people have heard, the uncanny valley.
Yes.
And it's really, really interesting how that it's so hard to get people to think something truly looks like a person when it involves a human. Yes. and the face in particular.
Yes.
Every little thing has to be perfect. And the thing that's been remarkable recently with these AI, the generative AI video, is in one sense, it has made a big leap in that it's gotten closer to crossing the uncanny valley than, say, like the Pixar style,
yes,
like 3D rendering. One good example of this would be like the attempts to de-age actors or replace actors in films in the past 20 years has always been like, oh no, that's not Grand Moff Tarkin. That's some ghoulish CG monster.
Yes.
It's like that's Princess Leia young. That's some ghoulish CG monster. Like you feel it like, oh no, I don't like that. A similar thing is happening in Zoom. It's low resolution. It's using compression and processing. And even if it was perfect, it's still limited by the resolution and dynamic range of the screen. So it's like there's an uncanny valley we're creating for ourselves all the time with actual real people by doing this.
Yes. And when you're on a Zoom call, have you ever noticed how much you look at yourself?
Oh, yeah. In fact, I do these Friday videos, and this is maybe inside baseball. I actually have a Zoom call up, and I am actually looking at myself doing it into the screen. I thought it would be helpful to have someone else, and my producer Nolan or Tim are watching. But I found I actually do. I maybe part of it, I'm looking at the framing and stuff, but I actually find like doing it. It's basically like I'm looking in the mirror.
Now, that is a completely unnatural thing for the brain to do. We are not meant, or we didn't evolve to look at ourselves continuously, because how many mirrors are there in the world for you to walk through your whole entire life looking at yourself? It's completely unnatural. And that's one of the reasons the experts say we get so exhausted when we're on a Zoom call, because we're not just looking at other people and trying desperately, the brain is trying desperately to pick up on all these little nuances that we would be doing naturally if we were in person. We are now also checking on ourselves all the time, which is completely unnatural.
It reminds me of Narcissus, right? Like narcissism comes from the story of Narcissus seeing his reflection and falling in love with his own reflection.
Yes, and staying there and never moving. And that brings us to narcissism, because I wrote an article recently about narcissism because people have been saying to me, is narcissism increasing? Are people becoming more narcissistic? And I thought, well, let me do a deep dive into that. And it's not actually the case that we're becoming more narcissistic. It seems like there's a particular percentage of the population that has stayed pretty stable in relation to narcissism. But the tools that we now have allow narcissists to amplify their message. And they do that really effectively, where the majority of people are not narcissists and don't feel the need to do that. This group of people do. So it seems like there are a lot more of them, but they're not actually more in number. However,
keep going.
There is some research that suggests that parents can make their children have some narcissistic tendencies. In other words, I am so special. I deserve special treatment. Don't say anything harsh to me because my feelings are more important than anyone else's. So there is a tendency for that as well. So, sorry.
No, I was going to say, well, two things. One was I've had Dr. Drew on the show a couple times, and he talked about narcissism and specifically the index survey that is used to measure narcissism. As you dove into it, what do you think of that index? Is it valid? That's one of the things that's always so hard with all this stuff and all these studies. We talked about sort of the replication crisis right at the start of our conversation. So much of this smells like scientism to me. Like it's hard to know, like, are we measuring the thing that we think we're measuring? So how do we know when someone is a narcissist versus just, like how do we understand what narcissism is neurologically?
Well, this is part of the challenge with mental health issues and personality disorders. I can't give you a blood test and say, hey, John, you got narcissism. It doesn't work that way. And then we also have, a scale. So the index is looking at people that can be diagnosed with narcissism. So it will look at the extremes on this continuum. We have a lot of people that fall somewhere on that continuum. So they've got some narcissistic tendencies, but they don't have full-blown narcissism.
Well, I've been taught, and Dr. Drew said this, and the other things I've read said, like, everyone, like, this scale, there is a healthy amount. You can't have zero.
Yes.
You need to have some amount of, I guess, concern for yourself and your well-being and your continuation and your success. And then it, like all things, like, you can't have too much of it.
And that's part of the problem. So I don't know how our online activity has shifted how people are perceiving themselves. I think that there is some of that mixed into this whole process. But I'm not an expert in narcissism. One thing I can promise you is that it can't be detected in the brain. So I can't give a person a brain scan either and say, hey, this is a narcissist. That doesn't exist either. So you have to look at people's behavior and say, okay, this is pretty narcissistic behavior. But the problem is we've had concept creep in this as well. So you'll have a person who had a problem with a relationship and say, definitely a narcissist. And you go, no, not actually, because there were a few things that were a little bit off, but this person isn't a narcissist in the general sense of it. So complex issue. Social media has impacted this, the way we see ourselves, the way we're reporting on ourselves, the kind of people that show up as well to be asked, hey, how do you see yourself? How do you know those people aren't self-selecting because they want to be noticed? So you have all of these confounding variables that interfere with this. So when you study any of these things, you have to keep a healthy skepticism. And I think that that's important. But ultimately, you look at how people live their lives. What do they believe in? What do they value? Is this leading to a life that is of meaning and fulfillment? And if it's not, then changes need to be made. But this is the interesting thing. It seems that narcissists do have a role to play in our society. Because if they didn't, those genes wouldn't have found their way to today. And one of the things that some of the researchers say is that narcissism is still with us because people that are narcissistic are seen as being leaders and seen as people that can gather resources. And so the tribe would follow them and believe in them because it increased their chances of survival. Now, that's an interesting take, and I had never thought about it that way. So we may say, terrible creatures, we don't want narcissists around, they make life more difficult. And I think they do in many ways, especially in our online world. But they do serve some kind of purpose. How to keep them in that purpose is, of course, the multi-million-dollar question.
One of the things, so much of what we're talking about, especially this concept of the feeling of knowing, reside around the question of how do we know how to pursue the truth? Like, what is true? And I think, and how do we trust ourselves, let alone the information that we encounter? And I've been thinking about this partly in the context of our politics and specifically the role of the revolutionary impulse. Maybe this will make sense when I get through it with my thinking. Maybe it'll just sound like a complete non sequitur.
I don't think so.
But and I'm trying to grapple with something that I have that maybe is a hot take, which is that I think in the world in which we currently live, I don't know that there's much of a healthy role for the left as it currently exists. And what I mean by that is if you define the left broadly as the desire for radical change, radical revolutionary change, like, okay, we need to tear down the monarchies or, extract ourselves from the coercive force of the church in the Middle Ages, or free ourselves from Jim Crow laws and actual legal discrimination. Those are all like healthy uses of tear down the existing order, I would say. Like, those were positive, even though I'm Catholic, but I don't want church. I want to voluntarily be Catholic
yes.
in a free society.
Yes.
I'm very American in that way. But now we have essentially maximum liberty legally. So now that impulse towards radical change is attacking things that are objective reality. And the most obvious one, and the one that it's the most difficult to talk about, it's gotten less difficult recently because of the vibe shift, is gender. New York Times had an article a couple of years ago making a claim. It was labeled opinion, but that it was even published is kind of amazing to me. That the maternal instinct is just a product of the male patriarchal order. Maternal instinct. This is the blank slate kind of hypothesis. And like the most blank slate thing, which is also not at all blank slate, actually, is trans and queer theory, which asserts that there is no biological, the biology is not a thing, that large and small gametes are not a thing, that the differences between males and females, not just humans, but all mammals, are not a thing, and but that our feeling of what we are is a thing, which has also been weird because it's like, wait a second, so you can have this feeling of knowing that you're a girl when you're not, and that's real, but your actual biology and your genitals and your hormones and your brain structure aren't real. And I'm trying to grapple with, where is this coming from, that it is anything other than a bunch of batshit crazy people in the academy that most of us laugh at because they're loons? Like, how has this become such a big force, number one? And where is it coming from, like, psychologically, that it is a force in our culture? I mean, the Wall Street Journal on Saturday had a big spread, sort of one of these big articles about America's young socialists. And it was about New York and Mamdani supporters. But the person at the top of it, and maybe this is the journal poking fun or being selective, is a guy that's trying to pretend like he's a girl. The neurology of this, the psychology, psychopathy of this, I don't know what, like, how do you navigate that? Like, I'm lost. Like, is this all, like, the feeling of knowing, all I can think of is like, well, you have a feeling of knowing that's, like, objectively false. Like, no, you're not a girl. You're not. But also, like, there's so much, like, blank slate, like, lots of academia seems to think that humans are a blank slate. Like, that's, well, how do you think about that? How do you respond? Like, what do you understand about the brain? Let's start with gender. The differences between men and women, which right away, if there are, the blank slate is false.
Okay, so
I hit you with a truck of stuff
you did.
here.
But what I can tell you is that I came into this whole conversation after having just done a medical PhD looking at the female brain in deep detail. So the first inclination that I knew I was headed for trouble was when I did a radio interview that was recorded and was never aired because the person didn't like what I had to say about the differences between the male and the female brain, because there are objective differences between the male and the female brain, not just in how they function, but also in some neuroanatomical perspective. So I'm going to just name a few of them so that we are speaking just neuroanatomy now. We are not speaking about the feeling of knowing. We're not speaking about trance. We're just speaking about neuroanatomy. We know that in the human brain, the left and the right hemisphere, there is something that connects them called the corpus callosum. This is a robust network of neurons that connect these two sections of the brain.
And just as a reminder, remind me of with the left and right, their sort of general functions. Would you say left brain, right brain?
This is it's not the normal myth that goes around. But to make it really, really simple, if you have a look at Dr. Ian McGilchrist, he explains it beautifully. If we look at it from a huge, big helicopter view, we can say the right hemisphere is more interested in the big picture, and the left hemisphere is more interested in granular.
Okay.
Grasping what can I get right now. The right, let's have a look at this in perspective. What does it mean in relation to other things? Now, the corpus callosum is more robust. It's a bigger section. There are more neuronal fibers, connections between the left and the right hemisphere in the female brain. This is why it's a lot easier for women to win arguments. Okay, let's just bring some humor into this, because they just jump between the hemispheres much faster than the male brain does. Yeah. We also know that in the female brain, the prefrontal cortex is a lot busier than in the male brain. And just to bring some humor into this again, although it's probably not really humorous, that's why there are more men in jail than women. Women are much more careful to say, hold on a second, racing around at 2 a.m. in the morning in a car when I'm drunk, I don't think that's a good idea. Whereas the male brain will go, hey, that could be fun. Hopefully only before prefrontal cortex development. So that's another difference. So there's increased lateralization in the male brain, which means the male brain is more busy in hemispheres separately from each other, versus in the female brain. Prefrontal cortex, very, very busy. There are also things like the singular gyrus, and any woman that has had a child will know what the nesting feeling is. This is a couple of weeks, maybe a month before this child is coming. The woman will go, I need to get the room ready. And the husband will go, what are you talking about? It's still ages. No, I need to get it ready now. So the nesting influence in the singular gyrus is very much stronger in the female versus the male. It's also the part of the brain that allows women to pick up on visual impulses or visual perspectives of a face when it's pre-verbal.
Oh, so just personally, like I'm very conscious of of the question of knowing in this conversation, but it sure feels like my wife is much more quick to get what ends up being a correct read on people than me.
Absolutely. And
like she's got I call it intuition, but she's got it. Like we'll come away from some interaction and I'll be like, oh, that was a nice guy. And she'll be like, no, I don't trust that guy.
And she may not be able to say exactly why, but she just gets a feeling. And now this is where intuition is very spot on. And why do women have to have this? Because we need to be able to pick up what a child needs before it has words. We need to be able to pick up on pre-verbal movements and facial perspectives. So that is a lot busier in the female brain.
Reading the baby.
Yes. What is the baby's problem? The husband will go, I haven't got a clue. And the mother will go, I think it's this, let's try this. And so that part of the brain is a little bit more attuned to that. Now, I have to have a caveat here. The male and the female brain are more similar than different, but the differences are important and they are noticeable. Okay, so now let's just go back to this. That's also the part of the brain that's kind of like a relay station. So you've got a thought and another thought comes in to take that thought and out it goes. When a female brain is chronically stressed, rumination occurs. And that's the thought doesn't leave that little relay station. So women suffer more from rumination than men do because of that. And also because men seem to have more serotonin in the brain versus the female brain. So we respond differently to stress to the way the male brain responds.
Does this point towards why, as I understand it, women just generally score higher on neuroticism in the big five personality tests, or have higher degrees of emotional instability?
Anxiety and depression are definitely higher among women than among men. And that's one of the reasons. But there are a couple of reasons for this. One of it is that in our society, we have created a lot more psychosocial stress for women. So women are juggling a whole lot more things than they used to. And that's one of the reasons. But another one of the reasons are those magical things called hormones. They do impact the brain. They are not inert substances that just sit around there doing nothing. They are involved in how the brain responds to the environment. Why? Because they have to be involved in that. If you're going to be having a child and you're going to be bringing that child up, your body has to respond and your brain has to respond to be able to look after that next generation. And the hormones prompt that. So just as a very brief explanation in relation to hormones and neurotransmitters, estrogen is working with serotonin throughout the female reproductive cycle. When estrogen is high, serotonin is high. The same for progesterone. As progesterone fluctuates, GABA fluctuates, gamma-aminobutyric acid, which is related to us feeling calm and secure and at peace. Serotonin related to a whole lot of different aspects of our functioning, including feeling safe and secure and stable, appetite, sleep, melatonin, and so on. So as those hormones fluctuate, so do our neurotransmitters. We are not discussing something that we can negotiate with here. This is just happening under the covers because we are the carriers of the next generation. This is just neurobiology.
Now, how can it be that we sit here in 2025 and that there's anyone who claims that that humans are a blank slate, or that there's no differences biologically meaningfully between men and women? How? Because that is the equivalent of believing in a flat Earth. maybe it's even worse than that, because most people will never get in a rocket ship and see the spherical nature of the planet with their own eyes. But we all live in reality with boys and girls all around and can see the patterns really easily.
It's a really good question, and I don't have an answer to that, but I have something that I want to throw into the discussion that may highlight something that very few people think about, and I haven't read enough about it, and I think it needs to be part of this discussion. In utero, and as the body and brain are developing, we are exposed to all sorts of different compounds, but particularly in utero, hormones play a very big role in gendering the brain. And there are compounds called endocrine disrupting compounds, EDCs, that interfere with our hormonal system. And the way our genes set up how these hormones are going to play out in the brain development and how the brain is setting itself up for male or female. Because these EDCs can interfere with these pathways. They either mimic a hormone, or they block a hormone, or they just stop the whole process from occurring the way it should.
Yeah.
Now, there are a lot of EDCs in our environment. We find them in pesticides, we find them in plasticizers, we find them drifting around, and there are a lot of them, and they are accumulating because they don't break down with great ease. So my question is it possible that what is happening is that more women are exposed to higher concentrations of these EDCs today than they have in the past? And so children are born with a particular biological body, but their brain hasn't been gendered as strongly as it should have been gendered. Now, this is a question that I'm asking because I have not seen a lot of research into this, but I've looked at the effects of EDCs in the developing brain and in gendering the brain, and it's pretty sobering. So that's one question that I have. The other question that I have is that, and we've discussed this, hormones play this big role in how the brain functions, but believing that what you feel is more important than reality and believing that it's weighted really heavily has possibly counted against us in this instance. Because if you have a whole lot of people saying how you feel is more important than object reality, then you will follow that path, especially as your brain is developing. And if you've got a parent that has bought into this, because maybe this parent has a challenge with their sexuality and who they're attracted to, then they will be inclined to follow that particular narrative and introduce the child to this idea long before the child has ever thought about what particular inclination it has or how it feels. So you've got that aspect of it. Then you've got the child that is getting to the age between 10 and 12, as I mentioned earlier, where peers become more important than family. Connecting with your community is seen as a priority because now you're moving away and you have to go and form connections with people that you are going to be spending the rest of your life with. What happens if in those environments there's a kind of like a social contagion, because you've got these very high levels of anxiety. They impact how you're thinking and how you're feeling. And now you've got someone saying to you, well, if you don't feel okay and you feel a little bit disassociated and you feel a little bit numb because the world is a challenging place and you know that your emotions are so important, maybe it's because you're in the wrong body. So we have all of these confluencing variables that are operating in different ways in our society, and we can't separate our biology from that. And that's why I bring in the discussion about the EDCs, because they are very impactful on our hormonal system and on how our brains function. And just as an example, we know that pesticides, which are EDCs, are contributory factors to Parkinson's disease. And we know that because of robust research showing that conventional farmers have significantly lower rates of Parkinson's versus farmers that don't farm.
Oh, I didn't realize
with
that.
pesticides.
I'm not. That's the first time I'm hearing that. What is the how robust? You say it's robust. How robust?
Well, look,
what do we mean?
It's observational.
Yeah.
So you can never ethically go and expose people to this. But we know that there's a significant difference between conventional farmers and farmers that don't farm with pesticides. Why this occurs at the neuronal level is because pesticides are fat soluble. and they accumulate in our membranes, cellular and neuronal membranes, and impact how the neurons function. And they're particularly active in the cerebellum, which is where the movement disorder occurs in Parkinson's. So we know that these compounds impact the hormones of the pests, which is why they were developed. They were developed to interrupt their hormonal cycle so that they stop breeding. Now, whoever said to themselves, well, they're not going to impact humans, I'd like to meet that fellow, but never mind. What if that is part of this problem that we're seeing? What if it's a social contagion coupled with this EDC exposure, coupled with this feeling of your feelings are more important than object reality? What happens if these are all combined? And now we're sitting in this mess. Because we know one other thing. From a psychological perspective, we know that people who disassociate because of trauma, and this is often related to, they disassociate from their body because it's too uncomfortable to live in their body. And so it's very easy for them to believe that disassociating from their body is also disassociating from their gender. And so that could be a confusion that a lot of these people are experiencing. But they may just want to fit into a tribe, and they may want to just be individuals. These are questions we don't know. So whenever I look at the research, I'm troubled because I think the research or the data is dirty now. And the reason I say this is because the last time I looked at gender dysphoria as a true diagnostic condition, where this is a true case, where this does happen, I think it was 0.0005% of the population,
yes, and
then to 0.0014. So that's a very, very small percentage of the population. When you look at the data now, it's gone up.
But substantially, and yes, also seems the data, at least in terms of surveys, varies by political area. Like California has a lot more self-identified LGBTQ people. And yes, then you dig in, you're like, oh, a lot of them are like women who say they're bisexual but have never had a bisexual relationship. And that gets dismissed in our discourse as there's these two things that happen with this issue that I think contribute to broken conversation. So one is, why are you obsessing about this? It's such a tiny portion of the population. Right. To which I respond, yeah, that's fine, except that actually all of our kids are being hit with the messaging. So and I've seen it firsthand, and I've talked about it at great length on the show. That's why I talk about it, because I've watched the impacts on young, developing kids like mine. And like, why am I being told this? Why have I been given a pamphlet at my middle school saying that playing with boys' toys is patriarchy, which he brought home. But then also, it's like we do see these measurable, massive changes that are way. I mean, when you say like something like 25% of Gen Z say that they're not heterosexual, not just plain old normal heterosexual, going to have kids the normal way. That's a crazy high number.
It's a very high number. And that's why when I look at the data, I don't take it seriously in the true sense of the word, the way we would look at data, because they haven't taken all these confounding variables into account. And that's one of the things you're supposed to do in research. That's how we progress as a species in relation to science. We say, okay, hold on a second. Those were limiting variables. Let's control for them. So that's what bothers me about that. But it also bothers me about these EDCs. Because the more of them we have in our environment, the greater the chances are that there's going to be a tipping point. And I don't know if we've reached that tipping point. So I'm mentioning that on the show, but I don't have an answer to that. It's something that disturbs me immensely because I understand that this is what happens in utero. Hormones, compounds impact how that brain develops. You know, the brain is the most sensitive and sophisticated tissue in the known universe, John. We have no other tissue that is as sensitive. This means that there are things that can impact how the brain develops and functions that we probably haven't discovered yet.
Almost certainly. I mean,
100%. So we need to be open to that and say, hold on a second, but what do we do about it is the next question, because these are long-lived chemicals. You don't just snap your fingers and they're not in the environment anymore. So do we test for them and have a look at using real science, go to areas where we can say these are very high levels of EDCs and then objectively look and see if that has impacted these people. And at what age did these people say that they felt this way? Because I met a child and I know this child who I could see from a very young age felt as if they were in the wrong body. And this wasn't a child who had been told by its parents anything. I'm talking about, this is 15 years ago. You could see very clearly what this child gravitated to in relation to toys, in relation to clothes. And the parents tried to manage it, thinking that it was a stage. I don't believe that it was dealt with in the correct way, in the way the parents eventually decided to deal with the situation. But I could see that this child was not prompted to feel this way. This child felt this way from a very, very young age. The minute they could gravitate to a certain toy, a certain kind of clothing, a certain color, they did so. There was no prompting. So it does exist.
Mm-hmm.
But how much of our environment is responsible in terms of neurobiological or neurochemical perspective? How much is it the social contagion? How much is it because they need to fit in with their peers? How much is it because these people feel disaffected? How much is it because there's been real trauma? These are all issues that cloud this conversation. But just, maybe just to put a bookmark again around this conversation, there is a distinct difference between the male and the female brain. There honestly is. And hormones have a huge role to play in that. Even in relation to visuospatial skills and capacity, we know that men have a greater skill in that area. We know that women are more prone to cooperate. We know that women's brains are busier than men's brains. A large study that examined differences in areas that light up in terms of activity found that women's brains were busy in 70 of the 80 areas examined versus the male brains that were busy in significantly less areas. That's why you can have a woman making dinner, telling the child, I need to sign that form for school. What are you having for lunch tomorrow? This isn't multitasking. This is just the capacity to touch on a few things at the same time. Whereas the male brain is much more comfortable to be focused on one or two things. And
it's so fun. I mean, so much of this again, can feel like, well, of course that's true. Because, for example, if I'm on a phone call, and you can tell I'm Gen X because I do this instead of this. But if I'm on a phone call and someone starts to talk to me, I hear neither my brain shuts off.
Yeah.
And I will often, and it's not especially nice. I'll be I have to shut the fuck up because I can't hear anyone. And I'm I can't motion to the person on the phone that I'm being talked to and my brain's being short-circuited. It's please stop. Over the course of these couple of years I've been doing this show, I've found myself more comfortable talking about these more difficult things in a way that doesn't make me uncomfortable. Because I feel like it has to be talked about. We have to be able to talk about and grapple with reality and understand reality. One outcome of that is that I don't know how to think about, and I'd like to try to do this, is hold two things in your head at the same time, which is, on average, there's substantial differences that we can all see and that we all make jokes about, and that used to be the subject, and still is in many cases, the subject of just stand-up comedy about men and women, about relationships, about kids, about groups. Stereotyping. Stereotypes have kernels of truth.
They do.
They're funny because we experience them. They're funny in a Seinfeld way. And you have to be able to see those things and then also take each person as they come and not use your pattern recognition to stereotype the individual or have your own views turn into genuine bigotry. And I am somebody that doesn't like to clutch my pearls about all this stuff. People throw around bigotry language all the time. Oh, you're a bigot, you're an anti-Semite, you're this, you're that. And those people are just part of the toxic discourse. But it can be the case that you can just become like a stereotyping person that is not really looking at reality anymore, and you're not taking people as they come. An example of this would be the comment that will sometimes happen saying we should, is it the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage in the US? I forget. But repeal women's suffrage. That the problem in America is women vote.
Oh my goodness.
Now, I'm going to steelman that for a minute. The claim here is, well, voting, public policy, to do it well, can't be driven by emotion. It has to be some kind of like greatest good for the greatest many calculation, taking into account costs and benefits. It should be thinking slow, not thinking fast. It shouldn't be feelings of knowledge. It should be actual reality. Like, hey, I know we say the minimum wage is good because it feels good, but it actually hurts the very people it's supposed to help. So we shouldn't just do what feels good. And the argument would be, women in general are more emotional. They're more prone to emotional reasoning. They're higher in neuroticism. So we would have better public policy that's more rational and more cost-benefit oriented if women didn't vote. Now, I'm bringing this up for a reason.
Yes.
Because I'd like you to help me and help the viewer grapple with confronting the differences between men and women that are real, and holding on to what I would call fundamental American values of all men and women created equally and treated equally in law, but also treated equally in how we approach each other, which is to say, you see somebody from across the room, I don't know that person, I can make a guess because I know they're a woman, but I'm not going to actually do that really. I'm just going to try to meet them and get to know them. And I'm not going to go online and say these kinds of things about all women are this or all men are that or all gays are this or all blacks are that. Because that's not even true. That's like just false.
Okay. Loaded question. Okay.
Question/rant, which is my way sometimes. But
now, this is a very good question because it does call into play the strengths of the male brain and the strengths of the female brain and the weaknesses. Which is why, if you had to live in an ideal world, which we're never going to get to, but it shouldn't stop us from striving towards, you would have an equal representation of these strengths, and you would work with them to find the best solution, the best long-reaching solution that benefits everybody. Now, that would mean that sometimes you would lean more towards the emotional side. And that would mean at other times you would just be pragmatic and rational. Because this is what life requires. Sometimes you have to be one more than another. And I think that's one of the problems we've had in our society. We have tended to become more emotional or more feminized, if I can put it that way. And I don't want anybody to take this out of context because I think it's just a pendulum swing away from women having very little representation. So now we also have the virtue signaling involved in this. So even if you don't feel very deeply about whatever, if you don't say that you feel very deeply about this, then you're a bad person. Because we have this capacity with the way we think is that if I believe something, it means it's good. And if you believe it, it's very different to mine. It's bad. So we have that dichotomy. So if we look at what happens in the C-suite in terms of organizations, there is some research to show that you have a good mix of male and female in the C-suite, organizations are more successful. Because when they're sitting around making a decision, the males at the table will say, let's go for this. This is a great opportunity. We can make a lot of money and it's fantastic. And the female brains will go, hold on a second. That's going to be damaging for the environment. We don't want to do it that way. We want to do it a different way because we care about the children and we care about the environment. So then what happens is the male, let's just go for this and let's hunt and gather this thing, has to stop and say, okay, hold on a second, that's not so good because if that gets out into the public, that won't be a good thing. And so now they negotiate. And that's what we need. What has happened today is that is seen as a bad thing when people say there is a reality, because the men will say, hold on a second, this business is for profit. We need to make money in this business. This is not a charity. So we have to, let's look at this rationally. And I think that's what we've lost, John. We've lost the capacity to say, you bring some strengths, I bring some strengths. Let's look at them rationally and see what the outcome's going to be. Now, I'm going to throw something in that could be a little bit contentious for some viewers. One of the things that I see as a problem is in relation to the way women look at people who do bad things and the way men look at people that do bad things. So a woman is more prone to say, and these are generalizations because obviously we have differences and, there's a continuum. But generally women will say, that person that did the bad thing had a really bad childhood. And so we can't blame him for those bad things or blame her for those bad things because the childhood contributed to this outcome. And so we need to be kind to that person. Whereas a male brain may say, that person did a bad thing. That person needs to be punished. We need to lock that person away and throw the key away because that person is a danger to all of us, our families, our society, and our culture. So that is a problem because now you have women saying, well, everybody's actually good if you just give them the right environment.
This is a very interesting point, and it's a very it's very tied to ideology because the belief that we have a blank slate, this belief that sort of there's this natural world of Rousseau where we were all happy, so noble savages, and that there's a story here, and it predates endocrine disruptors, and it goes back to Rousseau and the Romantics and the post-French Revolution that is basically saying, no, we can evolve by embracing emotionality and we were a better people before this time of modernity and of the Enlightenment and of Enlightenment rationality. That's what that Romantic era was, and you see it sort of took over. It won. It won the world, the first world. We are all kind of romantics in a sense that there's some natural goodness, and if you stab a Ukrainian immigrant woman on a train, I need to feel bad for you because the fact that you stabbed that woman means you had a really hard life. Like that's what you're saying. That's out of the news, that crazy person that stabbed that poor woman, and it didn't get very much news coverage. And then this impulse to want to empathize with the victimizer, the criminal, that's real weird. But it's weird for me as a man, for sure. But it's weird that anyone wants to do that because it's well, but look what just happened.
Well, we are letting objective reality inform us on something, and that is allowing other people to say how they feel about that thing, and they feel that they know that that person that did that is not entirely to blame himself. Now, it may be, and I suspect that man is mentally ill. There is no doubt about that. But the fact that he's had previous convictions tells me that his mental illness shouldn't have been with him, accompanying other people in the real world. He should have been in an institution to help him with that mental illness. So there is that seems to be a bad thing to say, that you're not compassionate if you say that person should have been locked away.
Well, we see this probably in a certain sense in its most extreme form, and I've had some firsthand experience of paying close attention to this in films we've done and work and people I've had on the show, like Alan Graham, who does the Community First Village, with homelessness. So we have, especially in blue cities, what we'll just call a feminine approach to homelessness, which is you are on the street, you have some sequence that's pretty easy to predict, which is something like several personal catastrophic events, maybe family breakdown, maybe loss of job plus family breakdown and addiction, and probably underlying mental illness in like 80% of the case. And that addiction, which is partly maybe some level of self-medication, but then ultimately just substance abuse and addiction, has you living in squalor and filth and terror and sexual abuse and sexual assault on the streets, in the public, endangering yourself, others, and the public. And the response is distributing safe needles under the guise of harm reduction, which is the most crazy framing of things and use of language one could imagine. Here are heroin needles under the frame of harm reduction. Housing first, in which we will take you, you tragic, broken soul, under the grips of body and mind destroying addiction, and we will give you an expensive apartment where you can continue to do the drugs with the free needles we've also given you. And this is all couched as compassion. And again, this is part of this philosophical frame, this romantic philosophical frame, that all that really matters is the here and now and a sense of sort of hedonistic pleasure and emotions and feeling good right now. So it feels good right now to alleviate current pain. But if you take a deep breath, a lot of times no pain, no gain. A lot of times the better future involves pain now. If you want to get clean, you've got to go through getting sober, which involves going through withdrawal, which is going to suck. And so I know it, like on a personal level as a parent, and I'm a very empathetic person as a guy. I'm Italian descent. I like to cry. I cry. I'm a crier. I'm an emotional guy. Like, it is painful when your kid cries. When my son has had his heart broken, it feels worse than remembering my own heartbreaks. But it's not love to keep people from going through the pain that leads to gain. That's not love. That's selfish. That's narcissism. That's making me feel good by shielding me from having to do the hard thing. And I don't think it's motherly either. So help me with that.
Well, that's where the confusion and the complexity of being a human being comes in. These people make these policies, they put these laws into place because they don't actually understand human nature. And they've also been taught that discomfort is bad, that anxiety is to be avoided, that sadness and hardship is a bad thing. They haven't been taught that resilience is built through working through difficult things. You know, the obstacle is the thing that will teach you how to get to the other side of the obstacle. So we have all of these interacting factors, and then you also have peers saying, well, if you're not kind, that means you're a bad person, because kindness is seen as good and not being kind is seen as bad. So,
well, and even kindness, it's like a very particular definition of kindness, yes, that is fundamentally always and everywhere soft.
100%. So, and as a parent myself, I know what you're saying. When you see your child suffer, you would do anything in the world to stop them from suffering. But you know that if you prevent them from experiencing that pain, that life is going to teach them, which it will be a lot harder. And this is what has been allowed to happen. Life is teaching these people. And so the people that make these policies are trying to just continue this process of let's coddle you, let's make you feel good. We don't want you to experience any suffering. So we could talk about that as the feminizing of this whole situation. But as you're saying, it is not making it easier for these people. It is harder to face a difficult reality than it is to face something that you can kick the can down the road. And that is what we've done as a species in many of the situations we find ourselves in now. And it's easier to do that because for many reasons, one of the reasons I believe is chronic stress, and we can touch on this in a moment. Another one of the reasons is because we put something into action and we don't see the consequences of that for a little while after we've put it into action, because we hypothesize about what the outcome looks like, but we don't really know. But by the time that outcome appears, we may have become so convinced that this is the right path. How do you change your mind then? How do you go back and say, guys, we spent $150 million on this and we were very wrong?
It's the thing that I was thinking about over the weekend and this morning was that it doesn't seem like you can possibly have any form of knowledge acquisition if you forego pain, because it's always painful to be ignorant. So, and we are all born ignorant. So when you start a class, it's hard and it sucks because you don't know anything. And we don't yet have, and we'll probably never actually have, some upload chip thing. So for all kinds of reasons, including just like, I think the basic bit rate of the mind can't do it. But so you have to go through this process that we call learning. But another way is just it's I mean, we understand this in other contexts, right? Like muscles. Like you build muscles by breaking them, by tearing the fibers, and then it regrows stronger. And I think learning is the same way. You grapple with the pain of your ignorance and the frustration of not understanding what you're reading, or understanding how to do the math problem, or understanding how to like write this proposal in a way that makes any sense, and you tear it up and you're like, this is horrible. Like no pain, no gain is like the most basic lo-fi way to answer wokeism to me, because it's like, this is what wokeism offers the world broadly, that no, pain is evil right now. The only moral ethic is the alleviation of discomfort right now.
100%. That's what the lesson has been, that anxiety and discomfort is a bad thing. We haven't taught people that resilience is built through doing the hard thing. And, at a neuronal level, what you're doing, we are forming connections between neurons that haven't connected before. So in the beginning, it feels very unpleasant. You don't know what you're actually doing. You're thinking this thought and it doesn't make sense and it feels really rubbish. And you'd much rather go back to watching that Netflix show. But you've been taught that you are forming a new neural pathway. And the only way to get that neural pathway to be comfortable, the only way to be able to speak about this concept and be able to understand it, is by forming that neural pathway, by allowing those neurons to fire together. So they wire together. So that becomes a default process. We haven't taught people that, John. So if you don't teach somebody that, what is the end result? You are in trouble. I mean, I have now lived and worked on 3 different continents, and I can tell you, it is hard. It's not easy to walk into a different environment. The sky may look the same, people may speak the same language, but there are all these cultural undertones. There are all these things that you don't understand. And you keep on stubbing your toe, metaphorically, as you go along in this environment. It's not easy. But guess what? I'm much braver than I used to be. I now know so much more than I know. I now understand so much more about human nature than I did before. So each time it's harder. It's harder to do this thing versus not doing this thing. But we haven't provided the impetus. We haven't explained the value, because when you get to the other side of it, guess what you have? You have more self-confidence. You have a greater belief in yourself. You believe that you can actually make a difference in the world, and that you can't sell anybody. Children want to believe that it's all easy. And, we know that perfectionism is on the rise, because what they're looking at all the time is these perfect images. And we know conscientiousness is on the decline. And those 2 things going in the opposite direction are very bad news for quality of life and happiness and fulfillment.
Well, not to mention that, perfectionism can never be achieved.
Precisely.
To the extent you can try, being conscientious and persevering is the only path that you have.
100%. But now you see what's happened. So we've created an environment where we have set up everything perfectly for these characteristics that we need to be a happy, fulfilled species, although we're never going to arrive at nirvana. Those characteristics, we are not cultivating them anymore. And we're not doing that because we're not teaching children how to actually get them.
I want to come back to navigating the world of sex differences and doing so in a way that is both reality-based and compassionate or thoughtful or at least dignified, let's say. I'm not sure what the right term would be even, but I look at the sort of from afar, because like Malcolm Collins said, you know, he feels like he got on the last chopper out of Nam getting married, but like when he did, and I felt that was like, that immediately was like, oh yeah, no, that's it. Like I met my wife at work. This was before the age of the swipe apps, and I feel like I was on the last chopper out of Nam. But there, in the before times, which is not that long ago, I feel like we mostly in our public discourse in America, in like the 90s, which is the peak of Western civilization in America, the late 90s, we had this going on, which was you could crack jokes about gender stereotypes and everybody would roll their eyes in mixed company and it was just silly and you knew you weren't being mean-spirited. And like the general picture of the differences between men and women we all kind of broadly got it. It was like a common vernacular. Yeah. And there wasn't even a controversy around it at all. And I worked at Nickelodeon in the early 2000s, and we had several like super badass women that were like executives, and there wasn't any problem with that. But there was also like tensions, like in my own life with Lisa, because we met at Nickelodeon, and as soon as we got pregnant and had our son, and she loved her job, she changed. She was like, I don't want to go back to work. And it's like I'm bringing up these personal things because I do feel like, again, maybe this is my feeling of knowledge not being right, but I feel like we kind of had a pretty good general, like the baseline was kind of healthy. Like, okay, yeah, you know what? You're going to make choices in your life. You're going to go to college, but you know, you're probably going to want a family. That's okay. That's great. And now it's like we have to reconstruct all of that almost from scratch. It feels like it's been sandblasted, that like shared knowledge of reality and of a decorum that was pretty healthy. It wasn't perfectly healthy. There was Me Too and stuff, but that was kind of extreme. Like, what is your advice, or how do you think about this self-knowledge of the brain, of our inclinations, to help, I'd say especially young men, check their thinking about this world of sex differences as they navigate in reality and online? Because I think that's the part I'm worried about the most. I'm worried about a lot of things, but I'm worried about the relationship formation and the diverging of the sexes at the time where you're supposed to be forming the thing that matters more than everything else, which is like your life partner and your marriage and your kids. And instead it's like they're going like this, which is of course like correlating / driving fertility going like this. We got to be able to come back together. We got to be able to laugh at each other, not get crazy, not become weirdos and actual like stereotyping bigots that are just filled with anger.
It's a big ask.
Is there a rationalist way to get there? Is there like if Kahneman's little guide of like checking your impulses, like how do you think about this? Because you're in this space. So you said you study the female brain and then you like start running into like tripwires.
100%. Absolutely. So we also have a son, and he's aging close to 30 now, and we ask these questions of ourselves as well. You know, how is he navigating this world? Because this is the perspective that I have from this, is that there are many more young men who seem more traditionalists, and there are many more young women who seem to be the opposite. Mm-hmm. They're not valuing staying at home and looking after children. They don't see that as a very important role that society needs and that fulfills them deeply. And so
And then they get to 40 and they're miserable.
And then they're miserable, absolutely. But you see, once again, this is a multifactorial issue because society is telling them that it's more important to be successful and to be seen to be successful, because success is seen as what have you achieved visibly, not how you brought a child up and what kind of child that is in the world. And is it a contributing member of society? That isn't seen as being important. So our values have shifted so much, and what we believe is important has driven those values. So I think the people that are watching the show have already self-selected to think differently. So I would encourage them to continue doing that and to continue checking in with their thinking and to continue saying, maybe that woman, as a young man, maybe that woman isn't as progressive as she seems. Maybe she's acting that way because that's her peer group. Let me get to know her and let me see. What does she actually believe? What does she actually value? To have an open conversation about that. And if any young women are watching the show, to check themselves. Have they fallen prey to this belief that what you do externally outside a home is more important than being a mother? And that's the only advice that I have, because I think we have moved so far from what served us and what fulfilled us, even though it wasn't perfect in any way, shape, or form, that we will never go back to that place. It's not possible. We have to find a new way to navigate this new place. And I don't know what that looks like yet. There are, in complexity theory, they speak about emergent variables. There are things that are emerging as we go along, and we have to take cognizance of those. We don't take cognizance of them by ignoring them. We take cognizance of the fact that our brains are quite fallible and our brains fool us all the time. We have to ask good questions about how the brain fools us. And that brings me to some more research that I think is important, because I think this speaks directly to when and how people change their minds. Because unless people start changing their minds and start thinking differently about what they're faced with, we will go further down this road of division and polarization. So I don't know why this research doesn't get more attention, but when I came across this, I was like, wow, this is fantastic. And the reason I like it is because it speaks to our neurophysiology, our embodied being. And it's from 2010. These researchers decided that they knew, like we all know, that it's very hard to change people's minds. They don't change their mind. You can bring out the flow charts, you can bring out the stats, you can bring out all the data, you can put a pile of books and 50,000 journal articles down and they go, no. One of the reasons they don't like to change their minds is because of the feeling of knowing. The minute they hear that idea, they go, no, no, no. Or otherwise...
In fact, I've read some studies that show that people, when confronted with disconfirming information for their belief, they will be more inclined to dig in their heels?
Okay. I'm going to tell you the research because this was for me very sobering, and this is exactly what you're referring to. So what these guys did, they set up a really interesting experiment, and it used political candidates. So they made up these political candidates and they put people into 5 groups. So the first group, there was no difference in the disconfirming information. The person just got information about the candidates that they liked, and it was all good. Nothing disconfirmed what they already believed in these people. The second group...
And how did they know that in advance? Did the participants fill out a survey or something?
It wasn't about real political candidates. It was about imaginary political candidates. So they filled out a form and they saw these people like these ones, and so they did this group.
Okay.
The reason they did this, they knew that at a certain point people do change their mind, but they didn't know what that was. Because people use something called motivated reasoning to keep believing a certain thing. They're very motivated to believe that thing, but they believed that there was a tipping point, and they wanted to know what that tipping point was. The second group got 10% disconfirming information. That means information that didn't align with what they thought the candidate stood for. And then the third group had 20%, and the next group had 40%, and the final group had 80%. So they did this experiment, and they ran the data. And this is where it got really interesting. On average, when people got to 20% of disconfirming information, and this varied between 13% and about 27, 28%. So on average, about 20%, they dug their heels in. Even though the information was disconfirming what they believed, They dug their heels in.
Can you give like an example to make that concrete? Just like, what's that percentage mean?
It means that up until that point, they were saying, we don't want to believe that, and we're going to continue believing that this candidate is a good candidate.
So the turn point is, would I vote for this candidate?
Yes.
So
would I support this candidate?
That's like the change.
Yeah.
And then, okay.
So up until about on average 20%, they said to themselves, no, I'm going to continue believing for this person. I actually believe in this person more. This is the really sobering thing, is it was between 40 to 80% of disconfirming information. That is the last two groups. That's when people started changing their mind, only when they were exposed to that amount of disconfirming information. And you know why it happened? Because their anxiety level rose. So they call this the affective tipping point. Affect, mood, anxiety. They became so anxious that they couldn't carry on believing in this candidate because there was too much information. It made them feel too uncomfortable. And only when they got to that level, between 40 and 80%, did they start changing their mind. So the researchers came away from this saying there is significantly more to this whole issue of changing your mind. And somehow our emotions are linked to us changing our mind. Now, they don't go on explaining all the different reasons for this, but we know what those reasons are. People don't change their mind when they feel affiliated to a tribe. So we could have people in a certain group in society that don't believe everything in that group, but they aren't uncomfortable enough to move away because they are concerned about who their new tribe will be. And human beings are primed to stay with their tribe because their tribe keeps them safe and makes sure that they, aren't going to be killed.
Yep.
So we still carry that with us. And so they stay with that group of people until there's so much disconfirming information and they find another tribe that believes the same way they do.
I mean, this goes right to Jonathan Haidt and the Righteous Mind, right?
Yes.
And his models, the way he puts it is humans are, I think, 90% chimp, which is to say individualistic, and 10% bee.
Yeah, hivish.
Which is hivish and groupish, and that we're a groupish creature, and that actually, when it comes to our moral beliefs, when it comes to our the opinions we really care about, if someone from outside the group criticizes us or offers us disconfirming information, like if for example, let's say I'm in my group, and my group is super free market, and so somebody like, let's say Oren Cass, former guest of the show, comes on trying to say like free trade is bad. Now I think Oren's got his stuff messed up. I don't think Oren's got it right, but I'm inclined towards that because that's what I already believe, that free trade is broadly good, and that most of my friends are free market oriented. So I'm going to treat Oren like he's a foreigner. Yes. I'm going to reject him. I'm going to motivate myself to make arguments against him. But then at a certain point, if enough other people are coming at me, especially people that I trust on other things.
And respect.
And say like, oh, well, that's interesting. Oh, the Triffin dilemma about reserve currency. Like it can't just be arguments. Like the arguments aren't enough. It needs to be, you are in my tribe and now I trust you. And now I start to take you more seriously and I don't go into fight or flight mode.
Yeah, I don't defend my position as strongly because now I've got enough information to make me feel, hold on a second, there's something that I'm missing here. There's something that I haven't taken into account. And that is something that is harder and harder to do in society because of all the complexity.
Well, there's not just complexity, right? There's also, in the U.S., we have sorted. So we live increasingly among people who are like-minded.
Yes.
And in states that are increasingly single party in orientation and neighborhoods that are such. And then all the digital stuff, because it's all engagement-based, ends up being a confirmation bias machine.
100%. Now, that's why we have this problem. And there are a number of reasons why it's hard to get out of this dilemma. So the first one is algorithms. We've trained our algorithms. Our algorithms show us exactly what we're comfortable, keep our anxiety level really low, so we're really happy. All the things that are bounced back at us in these little echo chambers make us feel fine. We're right. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, as we've mentioned, tribal creatures. We want to just stick with our tribe. The third thing is that we don't have a lot of neural energy. You need neural energy to be able to go and contemplate something that is very different to what you've thought is the truth. And we don't have a lot of neural energy because our attention is as scattered as can be. So we're always looking at all these different things and we never pay attention to something long enough. We actually can't pay attention to something long enough. Gloria Marx, who's done a lot of research into attention and how our attention has become scattered, I call it fractured because that's actually what it is, has discovered that it takes us 23 minutes to get back on track after we've been interrupted. 23 minutes. So how much does that allow a normal person to get their work done? It's very difficult. Okay, no
and
wonder.
To get into like a flow state.
Very difficult to get into a flow state. And a flow state is very good for the brain. It leaves us feeling calm and relaxed and in control. So we're not doing that enough. Now, just as a little aside while I'm going through this list, the PFC is the inhibition part of our brain as well. So
what was the PFC again?
The prefrontal cortex.
Oh, prefrontal cortex.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So the prefrontal cortex, now, you're writing this report. It's a really complex report. It's taking a lot of energy. You're having to think about a whole lot of new things you haven't thought about before. And you know that you are expecting an email from somebody and it's an important email, but it's not related to this report. So now your prefrontal cortex is constantly inhibiting you from looking at your email, and that's using neural energy. It has to do that. Now imagine how many people are using neural energy to inhibit themselves from doing that thing that they want to do, whether it's a notification, whether it's checking TikTok, whether it's looking at a LinkedIn post, whatever. There's all this neural energy being used to get you to do the thing that you're supposed to be jolly well doing when all this distraction is shouting at you. So that is why people don't have a lot of neural energy today, to be able to say, you know what, I don't really know enough about that. Then we've got the scanning effect. I read about this last week, the brain says to itself, and you know what? That guy said X, Y, and Z, and I trust him because he said things in the past that I trust, and so I'm not going to look at this disconfirming information. So we have all of these variables acting against us ever being exposed to things we don't like and things that make us uncomfortable. And until we teach people that it's okay to be uncomfortable and that it's okay to be stressed and it's okay to feel a bit anxious because it doesn't last forever and you actually gain something good from this experience, they're not going to change because there's no reason for them to change. We have created an environment where it's perfectly fine for you to stay in your little echo chamber until your last breath because you avoid anything that confronts you with something that you want to believe in.
One of the things that seems to be the case that I'm curious how you think about through this lens is that the level of confirmation bias and tribal motivated thinking seems to rise as a share of of total thought, let's say, as the issue at hand becomes more abstract and more complex. So abstract, what I mean by abstract is further away from direct personal experience.
Yes.
And complex, meaning there are lots of variables. They are interacting in ways that actually make knowing cause and effect in a linear sense very, very difficult.
If not impossible.
So anything about macroeconomics, will this bill create jobs or not? It's literally unknowable. It's a hyper-complex systems problem. It's not knowable. So whether you like the bill or dislike the bill is really just a signal of underlying values. They're not nothing, but they're going to be values like, do you trust this government or not? Do you believe in the role of government in this instance or not? Or whatever. But it isn't like some math question you can solve. And I think this also expresses itself in the way in which people are experts in the things where they have skin in the game in their life, and they face the consequences of the choice. And when they don't, their beliefs just get unhinged. And one example is I've seen polling that, like, with regard to healthcare, that people, when asked, do you support universal healthcare? And, would you be in favor of, say, Medicare for all? 80% say yes. And that sounds like, oh my gosh, we've got a very left of center country. Ask the question again and apply any price tag that you will pay.
Yeah.
Like $100 extra a year. And suddenly it's like only 20% will say yes. So it's like, once there's skin in the game, once there's costs that I understand I will incur, maybe it kicks in thinking slow. I'm not sure, but it's like suddenly those beliefs go from abstract and basically like mood affiliation and to something else.
It's more concrete then. They've done research on groups of people who are wealthy and how they respond to a sale. They will take the expensive cars and use more fuel to go to the sale just because it's a sale, when it would have been cheaper for them to stay in the place where they live and just buy the thing there at the same price. So we know that human beings are driven by this energy, whether it's in terms of our neural energy, our physical energy, and also energy in terms of money. So whenever there's skin in the game, there's a default option to hold on a second. No, that's not really what I meant. So I don't know enough about the medical situation in America. From what I've seen, it's quite challenging. I believe that most of the bankruptcies in America are related to healthcare costs. People that have bankrupted themselves because of needing healthcare. I don't know if that's true. For me, it's very odd because I look at how Australia handles healthcare, and it's a really good system. I think Australia and Switzerland are two of the best places in the world.
Switzerland, if I had to pick a country to swap systems, it would be Switzerland.
Yeah.
And what most Americans don't know about Switzerland, or they don't even think about Switzerland, they just think, oh, we want universal healthcare, is it's actually like an incredibly private system that just has certain guardrails.
Yes.
There's private insurance. It's just, we have basically giant government, mostly socialized, and even the parts that are private are so heavily regulated that they're basically run by the government. But that's a sort of like, it's for another conversation, to be sure.
Well, I think it's a hugely complex issue, but I want to just mention something that I think is an important thing to keep in mind while we're trying to solve problems. So, more research. If you haven't noticed, I kind of like the research because I like to just go back to, what does the evidence say? There's a group of researchers that decided to find out what people do when they're confronted with a problem. And they started out with Lego, interestingly, and they said to people, okay, solve this problem with these Lego blocks. And what they noticed is that what 60% of the people do, they add more blocks, when the logical solution would have been to remove the block to solve the problem, or remove a few blocks. So they did that, and they said, that's very interesting. Does this only happen with Lego? And then they said, okay, let's try it with menus, let's try it with itineraries, let's try it with a whole lot of other things. And they found that on average, 60% of the time, people would add something instead of subtract something, when subtracting something was a much better way to solve the problem.
Feels like a kind of version of loss aversion at work.
Yes, but it's interesting because we come back to the neurophysiology. They then had a very interesting situation come up in a work environment where there was a new leader involved in this organization, and the leader was going around to ask people how things could be improved. And they discovered that in a ratio of 1 to 8, it was in the favor of additive solutions versus subtractive solutions. So they then decided, hold on a second, why is this happening? And the answer is actually quite logical for someone that knows how the brain functions, is that it is more neurally energy expensive to figure out a solution to remove something versus to add something.
Why?
Because you need to have a look at the situation and say, what are all the things that are going to happen if I take something away? Versus if you add something, you're watching as you go and seeing the end result. Also,
that's interesting.
Also, in our culture, we see addition as being positive. And it's much easier to show what you've contributed if you can say, hey, I added this thing. If you say, hey, I took it away, no one really notices that. So that combined with the neural energy to take something away to solve a problem is something that most organizations, and I suspect most governments, don't know. And that's why you get big bureaucracy, big government. Let's just add something else to solve the problem. Instead of sitting back using more neural energy, more distributed cognition, which is other people, sitting together and saying, okay, I can't see this. Can you see that? Let's see how we do this together. That's why that happens. We just add something else and we think it's going to make it better. And it's a natural inclination for the brain to do this versus subtracting something.
Man, that triggers a lot of thoughts. I mean, you're so right about the government element of that. Man, I'm processing that. I've been aware of that. It's like the economist who I've gotten to know a little bit, Robert Higgs, calls it the ratchet effect.
Okay.
That essentially there is a problem, you add a new law, it actually makes things worse, or even if it makes this a little better, it has all these other unintended side effects. And instead of being like, we should take that away, you say, no, we'll add another law, click. And because these laws all interact and often contradict each other, you just get this, it's brush that's building up at the base of the trees.
Yes.
And that's it's bureaucratic growth.
Yes.
And all the incentives. Oh, you add something, you get your name on the bill that you are responsible for adding the thing.
Absolutely.
But taking things away doesn't feel quite as good.
No.
Like it's exactly what you're saying. But we even see this in the natural world with forest fires, that if you prevent, this forest management is such a great analogy for so much of the stuff we've talked about, actually, because it's like, if you actively prevent small fires, you end up with massive destructive nightmares.
Yes.
This is the story of California. California's always had fires. It's got nothing to do with climate change. That's a bunch of BS. They do a terrible job because of safetyism.
Yes.
And I think it's also partly like nobody wants to be the person that started any fires.
Of course.
It's far better. So it's like, these are so, it seems like there's something about hitting rock bottom that has to happen for these sorts of things to be there's so much inertia, psychologically, neurologically, politically, through systematic incentives, through the other thing we didn't talk about, but in the political environment, you add something, you also create a constituency for it that then advocates for it, which makes it harder to remove, because now loss aversion and the people that will lose a thing will scream loud and become a lobby group, whereas the people who never got it don't know they were going to get this thing, and so they're silent. They're the invisible people. So you have to get to like Argentina, where it's so catastrophically collapsed that you bring in a crazy radical guy.
Well, this is the pendulum swinging. You see, it's swung so far this way, and we've done this throughout history. We know that this is what happens. This is what human nature gravitates towards. We try and fix this one big problem, and we fix it so well that now we've created this other huge problem.
We fix our problems good and hard.
Good and hard. And this is one of the reasons young men are really battling today, because women have taken the center stage, and I'm not arguing that in any way, shape, or form, and I don't want anybody to take my words out of context. But in serving women, we have neglected men to a very large degree. So this is the pendulum swinging. So we are not going to change the trajectory of human history. What we can do is get people to think more deeply about how we solve problems and how we check our arrogance in believing that we know everything and can see everything, because that's one of the biggest problems we have. Then, of course, we can throw psychopathy into the mix. And then we have another dimension, because psychopaths are prepared to destroy everything in their wake to get what they want, which is generally power, which generally comes with money. And they don't feel emotionally invested in the future or in the people that surround them because they have a different brain to our brains. And so you can't negotiate with them. You can't be reasonable with them. You can't expect them to behave with the interests of the general person in mind because they don't know what the general person cares about, and they don't care to know. So you have them gravitating to positions of power, and one of the reasons they get to those positions of power is because they stomp on everybody else in the environment.
In Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, he has a chapter called "Why the Worst Get on Top," and it's in a totalitarian context. But I think about the Soviet Union's history, and there was a person among the early Bolsheviks named Bukharin, who socialists will say, oh, it would have been so much better. We could have had Bukharin. It would have been great. It would have been a little more like Yugoslavia. And it's like, well, the reason you don't get Bukharin is because Stalin kills him. And when you have a race to the top like that, you're going to end up with Stalin types because, oh, I can win by killing all my competitors, and then I'm on the top of the pyramid. I'll just, somebody's going to be willing to kill all the competitors.
Absolutely. And if you speak against the competitor, you just die. So you actually are in a race for your own survival. So that's the problem we have. And we know that certain professions, psychopaths gravitate to those professions because they can have more power in those professions, and they can also be more duplicitous in those professions. And, you and I spoke about this before. Apparently about 6% of the population are psychopaths. And personally, I don't believe that. I believe that the really, really smart psychopaths never are known. I believe that they play behind the scenes and they pull lots of strings. They're clever enough to have other people do their dirty work for them, and they never get noticed. I think social media and the media generally has made it harder for them to hide away. And I see some of them are now coming to the fore because they can't hide away anymore. But generally speaking, I think that really smart psychopaths aren't as visible as we would like them to be. Because if you've got a snake in the corner, at least you know the snake is there and you can deal with it. The problem is that they normally move from disaster to disaster to disaster. And so the people in their environments don't generally get to inform the next environment of their victims.
There was a movie called, I think it was called The Corporation, came out in the before times, like the early 2000s. And it was a left-wing documentary, and it basically was like it was in the aftermath of sort of the corporate crises that happened, like Enron and WorldCom and this sort of wave of big company fraud moments. And its basic thesis was, what is the nature of the corporation? And it did it kind of like was framed around like creating like a psychological survey. And of course the conclusion was it's a psychopath. And there's been some that have asserted that the C-suite and CEOs tend to be psychopaths. Now, as I understand it, that is not true. That actually most business leaders are that the best way to succeed in business is to actually be in other oriented and to be service oriented, which makes sense because like you're creating services for other people. So having no notion of what other people want or care about is kind of a weird place to be in business. Where are the psychopaths from your perspective? As you've looked at this and you've looked at the data, where should we be like, this is a minefield that we're walking through right now?
Difficult to answer this, but I think you would find a lot of psychopaths on Wall Street, for example, in very large law firms, and also some in the medical profession. This is where they can exert power and influence and not be argued with, in a sense. The other area, I think, which is probably rife with them is in technology. They don't see the world the same way we do. We have a small group of people that are dictating how we interact with each other and how the world runs. And they are people that don't have the same beliefs and values that we do. For them, going outside and watching a sunset and being in awe of creation and being in awe of nature, that is not a priority for them. They want to be able to have a lot of money. They want to have a lot of power. They want to dictate how we do things. And basically, ensure that their services are kept top of mind. And they are slotting in perfectly to how the brain operates, because they are ensuring that we gravitate to high dopamine levels, that we stay cognizant of all the news. So we stay online to make sure we know what's going on, because we think if we know what's going on, we can plan for it and we can predict, which the brain wants to do all the time. So I think that it's very, very likely that a lot of psychopaths have gravitated to places like Silicon Valley, dare I say, because they have a lot of control over what's happening in the future and the world that they have created, which is a very abstract world. It's not a world related to in-person communication. It's not a world related to children playing outside in nature, where their bodies and their brains grow as they're supposed to and they develop optimally. They don't feel what normal people feel. They don't have the empathy and the sympathy that we have. Their brains are actually structured differently. And to expect them to behave differently is not possible. You can't expect them to do differently, because that's just how they are and how, and how they operate. So I think that we have played into their hands perfectly because of how our brains operate and how we gravitate to these things that give us a jolt of pleasure and motivate us and keep us connected. So that may not be a very popular answer, but that's what I suspect.
I think that is a popular answer, in the sense that I think there's a pretty broad and I think growing sense that the commanding heights of our digital world are weird people that live weird lives, that don't seem to think about values and what the good, the true, and the beautiful are in the way that your neighbor down the street does. And it's really hard to grapple with that, because one way to grapple with it would be a Jacobin revolution, right? And that usually doesn't end well. No. The American Revolution is actually a very conservative revolution as far as revolutions go. It's very historically anomalous.
That is true.
And I've been thinking about this a bunch, partly looking ahead to the 250th, but it's this Dad Saves America. I think about America. I'm an American. But the American Revolution was essentially a desire to keep a distant power from making an existing order that was broadly work. Hey, king, now, basically, as I understand it, the English crown got out over its skis with all of its sort of accidental empire, and it was getting expensive. And so they were like, man, we didn't even mean to build an empire this big. I guess we got to start taxing these colonies, because we can't really afford to keep this thing going the way we have. And the Americans, which had, at that point, it's kind of interesting when you think about the distance, because to be in America in, say, 1776, and it's we were British citizens. It's no, you had multiple generations living in this continent that had never even been to the United Kingdom. They were American already. Yeah. They just were well, no, I don't want anybody. No, what are you doing? You're going to tax this and that? You're going to house troops in my house? Scram. That wasn't the French Revolution. No. That wasn't off with your heads. Let's take 20,000 people to the guillotine in the streets. And then end up with Napoleon.
Yeah.
But in a world where every person is on these platforms, feels themselves being torn apart in their mind, looks to the leaders of them and sees strange robot-like people who are building bunkers on islands far away in case of an apocalypse that they also seem to be trying to accelerate.
Yes.
Yeah.
I know someone really smart who speaks about the French Revolution version 2. Have you read Joseph Painter's The Collapse of Complex Societies?
No, and this sounds like a book I would want to read, even if it's going to make me very upset.
It was written, I think, in the late 1980s. So there's a lot that he hasn't taken into account, obviously. And obviously these, AI and actually LLMs haven't been figured in. But he speaks a lot about how groups of people become polarized in countries. And he speaks about energy crises. And one of the things that I found really interesting, so I'm probably spoiling this a little for you, and which gives me a little bit of hope, maybe for our generation, is that he says that never ever before in the history of mankind have all of our civilizations been interconnected the way we are now, from a global perspective.
That's certainly true.
Yeah. And so he says when other civilizations collapsed, they were more insular. The Roman Empire did have tendrils elsewhere, but it wasn't a global empire.
Well, and it didn't have mass communication even among its empire.
Absolutely, 100%.
So the Gauls and stuff are starting to make trouble, and it's like, well...
Yeah, you guys are over there. We're going to go over there and just stay away from you. So
Constantinople still stands, and so be it.
Precisely. So the world we have today is very, very different. And so the desire to keep this very complex kind of house of cards going and operating, there's a lot of incentive to do that because the collapse will be catastrophic and it will be global. So what he argues is that it will be a slower collapse. It won't happen as quickly because of this driven incentive to keep it going, because of the complexity that we've created and all these interconnections. Now, I don't know if he's right. As you said, we live with this complexity. We don't know what all of these emerging properties are. We don't know so-called black swans. We don't know what could emerge and how the human being is going to respond to this. Because we do know about human beings, one thing is that they're not always very predictable. There's some things that we're very predictable in relation to, but we don't know about tipping points in relation to societies and cohesion and so on. So I don't know how it's going to end up. But I want to just mention some more research.
Sure.
Apologies if I'm mentioning too much. But I think it's interesting because it explains once again about how the brain functions. Now we know that chronic stress and what we call burnout and what I personally have taken to calling modern burnout, because this is not just related to work anymore, it's related to the lived experience. We know that that's on the rise. And we know that it's impacting organizations and it's impacting people personally. We know that mental ill health is also in deep trouble. And we know that for our youth, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But one of the things that was very interesting to me, and once again going back to the neurobiology of this, is some researchers decided to see whether acute stress and chronic stress impacted decision-making. And the way they did this was really interesting. They induced acute stress through, putting hands into ice-cold water. That's a generally acceptable form of producing acute stress for people. And with chronic stress, they gave them an assessment to see how chronically stressed they were. And then they gave them this experiment, or they did this experiment on them. And it was an interesting one because it was related to gathering fruit, like a harvesting experience, gathering produce. And they wanted to see whether chronic stress impacted them and how they gathered the produce that they were gathering. So it sounds a little odd, but it'll make sense as I go. And they discovered something really interesting, that when people were acutely stressed and chronically stressed, they exploited the environment that they were in. They weren't very interested in exploring another environment that had an unknown and an outcome that they couldn't yet anticipate. And they were curious about why this happened. What caused this focus on just this place and not venturing forth, when it would have made sense to venture forth because you needed to discover new places to support yourself and survive. So a number of researchers weighed in on this, and what they have come out with the hypothesis, which from all the other research that I've done and read, explains it perfectly. Once again, we're back to what the prefrontal cortex does. So when the brain is very stressed and neurons are bathing in cortisol, they are less capable of forming new connections, which means that the old robust neural pathways will be relied on. You do not have the capacity to say, hold on a second. You stop being creative. because the cortisol is actually stopping the neuronal connections. And it is not just doing that, it's actually destroying neurons that already exist, which is one of the primary reasons why people who experience chronic stress end up with severe memory challenges, because the hippocampus is very sensitive to cortisol, and so neurons die. So you now no longer have access to that memory that you had because the neuron is dead. And your prefrontal cortex is battling to form these new connections, to find new solutions to new problems that you haven't confronted before. And they call this the explore and exploit situation, the explore and exploit challenge. Now, we have these rising cortisol levels in the general population. And one of the ways we know that this is the case is because people are battling to sleep. So we know that sleep meds have gone up, and we also know that depression and anxiety has gone up, and we know that a brain that is chronically stressed loses the capacity to stay emotionally modulated. So it will then revert to anxiety and depression as a knee-jerk response because it can no longer assess the situation accurately. This is the way cortisol impacts the limbic system. So you have these high levels of cortisol, you have these new emerging challenges, you have this ongoing complexity, and you have brains that default to adding to solve a problem.
So adding more complexity and more stress and more cortisol as a result.
As a result, and then you also have limited creativity because the brain needs to be in a very relaxed state to be creative. So when people are relying on coffee, because they are I know this isn't coffee. When people are relying on coffee regularly throughout the day, maybe because their stress levels are very high, because they maybe haven't slept and they need to focus and concentrate, what they are doing, they're giving themselves a jolt of adrenaline. Because caffeine supports the release of dopamine, which brings adrenaline along with it, which releases something called more adrenaline. And then what happens is that adenosine, a compound that has to build up during the day to work with melatonin during the night for sleep to arrive, gets degraded. And so as the day progresses, the brain becomes less and less capable of allowing you to go to sleep at night because of this reduction in adenosine. And then, of course, you need to go to the bathroom because it stimulates your bladder as well. The problem is that caffeine, because it comes with adrenaline, stimulates focus and concentration. But it doesn't support creativity. When you need creativity, your brain shouldn't be stimulated with adrenaline or with cortisol. Creativity sneaks up on you. Creativity is that shower effect when you're in the shower.
Yeah.
And you have that moment where you go, why haven't I seen this before? You have that.
This is why sleeping on things is often the best way to get that fresh insight. It's always so weird, right? Because you're grappling with something and it's getting to the end of the day. This happens to me all the time. And it just doesn't all click, and you just feel like, I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. And you go to sleep, and suddenly the next day there's like this clarity, and it's like, well, where did this clarity even come from?
Absolutely. And you can't order it. You can't book it. You can't pay for it.
Yeah, you can't put it in your calendar between 10 and 11:30.
But you can do things to be able to support that creativity to have a greater chance of arriving and to set the scene. So going into nature is a beautiful way to stimulate creativity, because when we are in nature, our brains are involved in something that we call soft fascination or soft focus. So there are no hard edges, there are no corners. There's nothing that's too harsh unless the sun is really harsh. But generally, there are lots of different muted colors. You look at a tree, it's got lots of different greens. The leaves are changing shape. There are also fractals involved. And the brain naturally gravitates to that and feels calm and relaxed in that state. So your parasympathetic nervous system steps up. And in that state, you end up taking a lot of deep breaths, your cortisol level drops, and you become more creative generally.
This is what the romantics got right.
They did get this right, John. They absolutely did. And so we have lost the capacity to do that. The thing that concerns me most about the younger generations is that children aren't appreciating nature. They don't value nature. And you know what you don't value, you don't protect. And our biggest threat as a species from an environmental perspective is a loss of biodiversity. Nothing to do with climate. That's the biggest threat, is loss of biodiversity. But that's not a sexy thing to put on the news or on the media, is it? And people can't feel it directly yet. So if you can't feel it directly yet, and you can't tell people this is the hottest day in the last 3,000 years, then they don't feel it. If you say to people, hey, if there are no more bees, you're not going to get your produce, they don't feel that directly. So what they don't value, they're not going to protect. What they don't value, they're not immersing themselves in. They're not going out into nature and allowing their brains to have that break, allowing their brains to just take a deep breath and get away from the abstraction, see the world for the practical and beautiful value it has. And for me personally, one of the things that's really sad is that they are not experiencing something called awe. And Dacher Kelter wrote a lot about awe, and he spoke about how it's a beautiful mix between a little bit of fear and a little bit of wonderment and excitement. So you've got to feel a little bit small in relation to this thing that you're observing. The interesting thing about awe, though, is that they've also recognized that the most awe a person can ever feel is awe for another person who has dealt with a lot of obstacles and challenges and has come out on the other side. It's not actually nature that invokes the most awe, which I thought was interesting. But in relation to being involved in nature, we also have a spiritual connection to nature, and we end up feeling that there's something bigger than ourselves out there. We end up feeling that we have more meaning in the world than we anticipated versus in this vision one activity all the time. So nature is extremely important, and I encourage people to go out into nature much more than they do, to get away from this very one-dimensional experience that they're having.
I have a feeling that immersive video in your Vision Pro is probably not going to replicate that experience anytime soon, if ever.
I don't think it ever can, because we don't get an emotional response from it that is the same as being out in and involved in nature. You may have a sense of awe because you're observing this person who's created this amazing thing that your eyes are observing. But being in it day after day after day and expecting it to leave you feeling fulfilled and happy, it's not going to do it. It just can't. We are really, truly beings that belong in the earth, on the earth, with the earth. And trying to remove ourselves from that has not served us. And if anybody wants to argue that, you can just say there are a lot of contributing factors. Obviously, it's a very complex discussion, but has anybody's mental health gotten better?
This has been the collapse in mental health among the most privileged people in the richest country the world has ever known has been the most confounding and challenging thing for me as somebody that likes to grapple with big ideas and ideology and sort of systematic ways of thinking about things. It's like, it is not easy to think about. It's something we've obviously spent a long time talking about today. Have you become an American citizen?
No, I haven't yet. My children are Australians. So I feel like if I become an American citizen, then I'm not going to be as close to them as I would be. So no, I'm not an American citizen yet.
Well, I ask that only because this is your first time on the show, and as you know, I ask every guest at the end of the conversation about their role in the American story. Because as a dad, I feel like this is a role we as men play that is powerful and meaningful and purposeful and has an impact. Like, our kids will succeed us, and the way we behave as fathers in our household has an impact on the country. So, Delia, whether you will, for however long you will be here, how do you think about your role in the American story?
That's a good question, and I like that question, and I've wondered about how I'm going to answer that question. For me, I think that America is a country that sets the tone for the rest of the world. I think America has always been a leading country, and I think that America should stay being a leading country, because I've never been to a country where I have experienced less racism, more freedom of thought and speech, although that is being curtailed a little at the moment. I think America is the great experiment that has so far done very well. And my role is to try to get people to understand this beautiful brain that we have and how it contributes, how it can contribute to keeping good things going and making things better. And as I said earlier, I don't think we've ever been more in need of understanding how the brain functions so that we can catch its foibles and its quirks and stop that from upending this beautiful experiment that has worked so well for so long, but I think is in trouble at the moment.
Delia McCabe, thanks for being on Dad Saves America. This has been quite a conversation.
Thank you for the invitation, John.